Before the sun had fully risen on October 13, 1307, something moved through the streets of Paris that had nothing to do with prayer. Church bells rang as they always did, but their sound felt hollow, almost dishonest, echoing off stone walls slick with early morning mist. Torches flickered against wooden doors marked with a red cross. Men in armor stood waiting, parchment orders clenched in their fists, faces set with the kind of resolve that comes only when conscience has already been buried. Inside monasteries, commanderies, and fortified houses across France, the Knights Templar were still asleep. For nearly 2 centuries, these men had been untouchable. Kings bowed to them. Popes depended on them. Pilgrims trusted them with their lives and their wealth. They were warriors who prayed, monks who fought, bankers who answered only to God. Their white mantles and red crosses were symbols of protection, discipline, and divine authority. To accuse a Templar was to accuse the Church itself. And yet, on this morning, accusation came anyway. Doors were kicked in without warning. Brothers were dragged from their beds, still barefoot, still confused, still trusting that this was some terrible mistake that would soon be corrected. Some tried to speak. Some tried to pray. Others recognized immediately that something irreversible had begun. Shackles replaced swords. Silence replaced ritual. By the time the sun climbed higher, the order that had once guarded the Holy Sepulchre was no longer an army of God, but a collection of prisoners. The arrests were not random. They were precise, coordinated, almost surgical. Every major Templar stronghold in France was targeted at the same hour. The orders had been sealed weeks earlier, delivered secretly to royal officials with instructions not to open them until the night before. This was not justice unfolding. This was a plan executed. The charges, when they came, were shocking. Heresy, idol worship, blasphemy, spitting on the cross, secret rituals too vile to name. To the public, the accusations sounded monstrous. To the knights themselves, they sounded unreal. Many had spent their entire lives under vows stricter than most monks. They had sworn obedience, chastity, poverty. They had endured hunger, heat, blood, and fear in distant lands. And now they were told they were enemies of the faith they had defended with their lives. But beneath the spectacle of sin and scandal lay something far more dangerous than heresy. That King Philip IV of France was drowning in it. Wars, failed currency reforms, and a lavish court had emptied the royal treasury. The one institution wealthy enough to rescue the crown was the very order now being accused. The Templars did not merely guard money. They invented systems of credit, letters of exchange, and secure transfers that made kings dependent on them. They were the bankers of Europe long before the word existed. A king who owes everything is never truly king. And so, with a single stroke, Philip attempted the impossible: to erase his creditors from history, to seize their assets, to break their authority, to destroy their name so thoroughly that no one would dare ask what happened to their wealth afterward. Yet even as the arrests unfolded, something did not add up. The order was vast. Thousands of knights, sergeants, priests, and servants stretched across Europe and the Mediterranean. Their network was international, disciplined, and deeply interconnected. And still, no warning seemed to spread. No mass escape. No unified resistance. It was as if the Templars had already accepted their fate. Or as if the fate unfolding was not the one that mattered most. Because while the arrests were thorough, they were not total. The focus was on the brothers themselves, not on those who lived around them. The servants were questioned and released. The tenants remained on the land. The families who had long interacted with the order were left untouched. Wives were not dragged into the streets. Children were not named in the accusations. Records were seized, but lineages were not examined. History would later say the Templars were celibate, that they left no heirs, that their destruction was clean and complete. But history often says what power requires it to say. Confessions soon followed, extracted under torture so brutal that even seasoned inquisitors would later express discomfort. Men admitted to crimes they did not understand. Repeated words fed to them between screams, and begged for death as mercy. Some recanted when torture stopped. Others stood by their statements out of sheer exhaustion. Truth became irrelevant. The narrative had already been written. Public opinion turned quickly. Fear spreads faster than facts, and the idea that a secretive military order had hidden dark rituals behind monastery walls was irresistible. The fall of the Templars became a moral lesson, a warning against pride and power. The Church, pressured and cornered, hesitated just long enough to appear conflicted before eventually dissolving the order altogether. And yet, even as flames consumed Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, something strange lingered in the aftermath. The wealth of the Templars never fully appeared in royal coffers. Some lands were transferred, others vanished into legal disputes that dragged on for decades. Ships once docked at Templar ports were no longer there. Treasure, if it existed in the form legends would later imagine, was nowhere to be found. But more importantly, neither was continuity. Orders die all the time in history. Armies disband. Religions fracture. But what rarely disappears so cleanly is influence, knowledge, relationship, blood. The official story insists that the Templars ended on that cold October morning, their legacy reduced to ruins and rumors. But the speed of their fall, the narrow focus of the arrests, and the survival of certain networks raise uncomfortable questions. Questions medieval chroniclers avoided. Questions modern historians often sidestep. If the goal was total destruction, why leave so many threads intact? Why were certain regions, like Scotland and Portugal, suddenly hospitable to former Templars? Why did new orders arise overnight, staffed by the same men under different names? Why did some families, previously obscure, rise in power and wealth in the generations immediately following the purge? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why does the idea of Templar bloodlines provoke such resistance, even today? This is where the story truly begins. Not with swords and armor, but with inheritance. With children who were never recorded. With names that changed while alliances remained. With families who learned that survival does not always mean fighting back. It sometimes means blending in, waiting, and remembering. The night the order fell was loud, violent, unforgettable. But the morning after was quiet. And in that quiet, history may have missed what mattered most. Because institutions can be destroyed in a single day. But bloodlines are far harder to erase. Long before kings feared them, before their banners flew over fortresses and their coffers rivaled royal treasuries, the Knights Templar were almost invisible. They did not begin as conquerors or financiers. They began as men with no land, no wealth, and no future that anyone else would have envied. In the early years after the First Crusade, Jerusalem was a fragile prize. Christian pilgrims traveled thousands of miles to reach the holy sites, only to be robbed, enslaved, or killed on the roads leading to the city. The Holy Land had been captured, but it was not safe. Into this uncertainty stepped a small group of knights led by a French nobleman named Hugues de Payens. Around 1119, he and 8 companions took vows not to a king, but to a life of service and restraint. They promised to protect pilgrims, to live in poverty, and to obey their superiors without question. There was no grand ceremony, no papal decree announcing their arrival. For years, they lived quietly, housed near the ruins of what was believed to be Solomon's Temple, a location that would later give them their name. They owned little more than their weapons, their horses, and their faith. What made them unusual was not their mission, but their identity. These men were both monks and warriors, bound by religious vows yet trained for violence. At the time, this combination unsettled many within the church. Warfare was seen as spiritually dangerous. Killing, even in battle, risked eternal consequences. To sanctify such an existence required a radical shift in thinking. That shift came in the form of a powerful ally. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential churchmen of the 12th century, took up their cause. He argued that fighting in defense of Christendom was not a sin, but a sacred duty. The knight who killed in such service did not damn his soul. He purified it. With Bernard's endorsement, the once obscure brotherhood gained legitimacy. Papal approval followed. Donations flowed in. Land, money, and privileges were granted by nobles eager to support a holy cause, and perhaps to secure divine favor for themselves. The transformation was swift. Within decades, the Templars spread across Europe and the Levant. Commanderies appeared in France, England, Iberia, Italy, and beyond. Each served as a local hub, managing land, collecting rents, and supporting the order's activities overseas. While individual knights remained bound to vows of poverty, the institution itself became extraordinarily wealthy. This was not a contradiction in their eyes. Wealth, they believed, was a tool to be used in God's service, not a personal indulgence. Discipline defined their daily lives. The rule of the order dictated everything from how they dressed to how they ate, slept, and spoke. Meals were taken in silence. Personal possessions were forbidden. Disobedience was punished swiftly. Even laughter was regulated. The white mantle they wore was meant to symbolize purity and sacrifice, a constant reminder that the self had been surrendered to something greater. Yet beneath this rigid structure was a reality far more human. The Templars were not born monks. They came from noble families, often second or third sons with little inheritance waiting for them. Many entered the order as young men, carrying with them memories of home, family expectations, and a world beyond the cloistered life. Their vows demanded chastity, but enforcing such vows across distant outposts, in war zones over decades, was never as absolute as the rule suggested. Templar commanderies were not isolated monasteries. They were economic centers embedded in local communities. They employed servants, hired laborers, interacted with merchants, and negotiated with nobles. Knights traveled constantly, moving between Europe and the Holy Land. They were respected, feared, and often admired. In such an environment, the idea that every knight lived a life entirely severed from emotional attachment strains belief. Over time, the order became more than a military force. It evolved into a logistical and financial machine unlike anything medieval Europe had seen. The Templars developed systems to safely transfer money across vast distances, allowing pilgrims and nobles to deposit funds in one country and withdraw them in another. They stored royal treasures, managed estates, and even financed wars. Their commanderies became early banks, their seals a guarantee of trust. This success came at a cost. As their influence grew, so did resentment. Other orders envied them. Kings relied on them but bristled at their independence. Bishops resented their exemption from local authority, as the Templars answered directly to the Pope. They paid no taxes, ignored secular courts, and operated under their own internal justice. Still, for generations, the balance held. The Templars were useful. They fought where others would not. They loaned when others could not. They kept secrets, settled disputes, and maintained networks that crossed borders in a fragmented world. And through it all, the order insisted on a single defining principle. The brotherhood came before all else. But institutions that endure rarely do so by ideology alone. They survive because they adapt. As decades turned into centuries, the original purpose of the Templars began to blur. The Crusader states weakened. Jerusalem was lost. The military justification for the order diminished, but its economic and political role only expanded. The Templars were no longer simply defenders of pilgrims. They were administrators, diplomats, and power brokers. With this shift came quiet compromises. Some knights never left Europe at all, managing estates for their entire careers. Others returned from the East permanently, wounded or disillusioned. The order grew older. Leadership positions were held by men who had spent decades navigating both sacred vows and worldly realities. Absolute ideals softened at the edges. Records from the period are careful, often vague, but hints emerge. Knights granted favors to local families. Lands were leased under unusually generous terms. Trusted households became intertwined with Templar estates for generations. The lines between service, loyalty, and kinship blurred. Officially, the order owned everything, and no knight owned anything. Unofficially, continuity required trust. And trust, in medieval society, was most often secured through blood and marriage. The contradiction at the heart of the Templars was never fully resolved. They were sworn to poverty, yet managed immense wealth. They were bound to chastity, yet embedded in communities where lineage defined power. They were forbidden heirs, yet surrounded by families who depended on them. This tension did not doom the order. It sustained it. By embedding themselves into the social fabric of Europe, the Templars ensured stability, influence, and resilience. They did not see this as betrayal of their vows, but as service to a greater mission that transcended individual lives. By the time their enemies moved against them, the Templars were no longer just an order of men in white mantles. They were a system, a network, a presence woven into land ownership, finance, and local governance across continents. To destroy such a system required more than arrests and accusations. It required a story that reduced them to sinners and heretics, stripped of complexity and humanity. And even then, what was destroyed was only the visible structure. The deeper foundations, the relationships, the loyalties, the quiet understandings built over generations, were far harder to dismantle. Because the Knights Templar were never only warriors of faith. They were sons of families, stewards of land, and participants in a world where survival often depended not on strict obedience to ideals, but on the ability to bend without breaking. And in that bending, the seeds of something enduring were already planted. The rule of the order was clear, written in ink that allowed no ambiguity. A Knight Templar was to live as a monk, untouched by desire, unburdened by personal attachment, and entirely severed from the ordinary bonds of family. He would own nothing, inherit nothing, and leave nothing behind. His loyalty belonged to God, the order, and the mission. In theory, this made the Templars perfect instruments, men without distractions, without heirs, without legacy beyond obedience. But theory rarely survives contact with human life. The men who joined the order did not emerge from monasteries or from nothing. They were born into families, often noble ones, where lineage defined identity and duty. Even those who entered the order young carried with them a sense of belonging shaped long before they took vows. In medieval Europe, family was not merely emotional, it was political, economic, and existential. To be without kin was to be without protection. The Church understood this tension, even if it rarely acknowledged it openly. Monastic rules demanded chastity, but history shows that enforcement varied widely. In remote commanderies far from Rome or Paris, oversight was minimal. Templar houses dotted the countryside, staffed not only by knights, but by servants, tenants, craftsmen, and local laborers. These were not sealed worlds. They were living communities. Within these spaces, the ideal of absolute separation became difficult to maintain. Letters from the period, carefully worded and frustratingly incomplete, hint at relationships that were never meant to be recorded. A knight who intervenes repeatedly on behalf of a particular household. A child fostered unusually close to a commandery. Land granted with conditions that seem personal rather than administrative. These are not proofs but patterns, and patterns are how hidden systems reveal themselves. Official chroniclers insisted that Templars were celibate and left no heirs. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when there were strong incentives to keep certain truths unspoken. Acknowledging families would have undermined the spiritual authority of the order and invited scrutiny from rivals already eager to discredit them. And yet, whispers persisted. Local traditions in parts of France, Iberia, and Italy speak of the knight's children, raised under different names, protected by allied families, or absorbed quietly into the lower nobility. These stories were not scandalous tales of broken vows, but pragmatic arrangements, understandings between men who knew that absolute purity was an ideal, not always a reality. The medieval world was deeply practical. Institutions survived by adapting, not by clinging rigidly to doctrine. For the Templars, whose influence depended on land, loyalty, and continuity, the idea of having trusted bloodlines nearby was not heretical, it was strategic. This did not mean that the order openly encouraged marriage or fatherhood. Far from it. The rule remained strict, and public violations were punished. But discretion mattered. What was not spoken could not be condemned. Relationships that did not disrupt discipline, that remained quiet and controlled, were often tolerated. It is also important to understand how medieval definitions of family differed from modern ones. Fosterage was common. Children were sent to be raised in other households to strengthen alliances. Guardianship could blur into parenthood without ever being named as such. A Templar knight might never acknowledge a child as his own, yet still ensure their education, protection, and future. Women played a crucial role in this silent system. Noble women, widows, and members of religious houses often acted as intermediaries, raising children whose parentage was deliberately obscured. In a world where reputation could determine survival, secrecy was a form of mercy. The contradiction was profound. The Templars preached renunciation, yet participated in a social order built on inheritance. They rejected personal legacy, yet understood that institutions endured through continuity. This tension did not weaken the order, it strengthened it, allowing it to function across generations without ever admitting how. Over time, certain families became closely associated with Templar estates. They served as stewards, administrators, or military allies. Their names appear repeatedly in land records, always near Templar holdings, always benefiting from favorable arrangements. When the order prospered, these families prospered alongside it. Were these merely loyal supporters? Or were they something closer? The question becomes sharper when examining what happened during the suppression. When the arrests came, they targeted knights, not households. Children were not interrogated. Women were not accused. Families connected to the order were rarely punished unless they held official positions. This selective justice suggests that the threat was perceived as institutional, not biological. If the Templars truly had no families, there would have been nothing to protect. Yet the pattern of avoidance implies caution, as though certain lines were known but deliberately left alone. There is also the matter of age. Many Templars joined young and served for decades. When they grew old, ill, or injured, they were often retired to commanderies rather than expelled. In these later years, removed from battle and daily discipline, their lives became quieter, more domestic. It is here, historians suggest, that the boundaries blurred most often. An aging knight, overseeing an estate, interacting daily with the same households, could form bonds that defied formal categories. Care, responsibility, affection, these did not require official acknowledgement to exist. Critics argue that such ideas romanticized the order, projecting modern sensibilities onto medieval men. But the opposite may be true. Medieval society was less rigid in practice than its laws suggested. Survival demanded flexibility, and institutions that failed to adapt vanished quickly. What makes the Templars unique is not that they may have broken their rules, but that they may have done so in a controlled, strategic way, protecting the appearance of purity while quietly ensuring resilience. This raises an unsettling possibility. If the order understood that its power made it a target, then planning for survival beyond its own existence would have been logical. Wealth could be seized, titles could be stripped, but blood, once dispersed, could not be easily reclaimed. Families could endure where institutions could not. This idea transforms how we interpret the fall of the Templars. Instead of a sudden, total collapse, it becomes a calculated sacrifice, an outer shell discarded while something deeper slipped into obscurity. There is no document that confirms this, no confession that survived the fires. What remains are inconsistencies, silences, and the stubborn persistence of certain families in the shadow of Templar history. The white mantle, with its red cross, may have been burned and banned, but the people who wore it did not simply vanish into ash. They returned to a world that still recognized blood, loyalty, and quiet obligation. And in that world, the idea of a bloodline, unspoken, unnamed, but carefully preserved, was not a rebellion against faith. It was a guarantee that something of the order would outlive its destruction. Not as knights, but as families. Survival is rarely a matter of strength alone. More often, it depends on foresight, on the quiet ability to change before change is forced upon you. The Knights Templar were trained for battle, but their greatest talent was not the sword. It was organization. From their earliest days, they understood that endurance required structure, redundancy, and planning beyond the present moment. The world they operated in was unstable. Kings rose and fell. Alliances shifted with marriages and betrayals. Crusader states collapsed almost as quickly as they were formed. Any order that tied its fate too closely to a single ruler or a single purpose risked extinction. The Templars learned this lesson early, and they learned it well. Outwardly, they presented themselves as unyielding. Their rule emphasized obedience, uniformity, and discipline. They dressed alike, ate alike, prayed alike. Individual identity was meant to dissolve into the collective. This image was not accidental. Projected strength, reliability, and moral clarity. It reassured donors and intimidated rivals. But beneath that surface, the order was remarkably flexible. Templar commanderies were designed not only as religious houses or military outposts, but as adaptable centers of administration. Each could function independently if cut off from the rest. Resources were distributed, not centralized. Knowledge was shared across regions, but authority was local enough to allow rapid adjustment to changing conditions. This decentralized model made the order resilient. It also made it difficult to destroy completely. The Templars did not rely solely on their knights. They cultivated relationships with local elites, merchants, craftsmen, and landholders. These were not casual connections. They were long-term partnerships, reinforced by mutual benefit and trust. Over time, some families became indispensable to the functioning of nearby commanderies, handling logistics, finances, and negotiations. Trust in the medieval world was rarely abstract. Contracts mattered, but blood mattered more. A family with a stake in Templar success was a family likely to protect its interests, even when the political winds shifted. This is where the unwritten rules emerged. Officially, the Templars existed outside the feudal system. They did not swear fealty to local lords, and they did not pass land through inheritance. In practice, however, they had to operate within a society that understood power almost entirely through lineage. Ignoring this reality would have isolated them. So they adapted quietly and selectively. Land might be leased to the same family for generations. A steward's son might replace his father without formal acknowledgement. Alliances were maintained not through marriage vows, but through continuity of service and favor. These arrangements created a shadow form of inheritance, one that benefited both the order and the families involved. Such systems were not recorded in grand charters. They lived in custom, expectation, and mutual dependence. And because they were not written, they were difficult to attack. The longer the Templars existed, the more they understood that their visibility was both a strength and a vulnerability. Their exemption from taxes and local authority made them powerful, but it also made them conspicuous. Envy grew alongside admiration. Accusations followed success as surely as night followed day. By the late 13th century, the signs were impossible to ignore. The Crusades had failed to secure lasting control of the Holy Land. The original justification for the order was fading. Meanwhile, European monarchs were consolidating power, less willing to tolerate independent institutions that answered to no one within their borders. The Templars had faced threats before, but this felt different. It was not a military challenge, but a political one. Armies could be defeated. Institutions could be dismantled. What could not be easily undone were networks embedded in daily life. If the order were ever to fall, it would not be enough to hide treasure or relocate knights. What needed protection was influence, memory, and continuity, and for that, written records were a liability. Blood, however, left no ledgers. The idea of survival beyond the institution required a shift in thinking. The Templars had always emphasized collective identity, but now they had to consider legacy without formal inheritance. This meant ensuring that those who understood their methods, values, and connections could carry them forward under different names and loyalties. Families were the perfect vessels for this task. Children raised within or near Templar communities absorbed its culture instinctively. They learned discipline, discretion, and loyalty without ever being sworn in. They knew which alliances mattered, which names carried weight, which silences were necessary. They could move in the world freely, unburdened by vows or suspicion. This was not a conspiracy hatched in secret councils. It was an organic evolution driven by necessity. Institutions that survive do so by dispersing their essence, not by clinging to a single form. When historians later search for evidence of such strategies, they are frustrated by the lack of documentation. But this absence is itself telling. The Templars were meticulous record keepers when it served them. They did not simply forget to document what mattered most. The unwritten rule was simple: what must endure should not be named. This approach explains many of the puzzles surrounding the Order's end. The apparent lack of resistance, the orderly transfer of certain assets, the rapid reappearance of former Templars in new roles and new orders. None of this suggests chaos. It suggests preparation. It also explains why accusations focus so heavily on ritual and belief rather than on administration or family life. Heresy was easier to prosecute than kinship. Spiritual crimes justified destruction without forcing uncomfortable questions about property, obligation, or continuity. By attacking the visible shell of the Order, its enemies may have believed they were erasing it entirely. But shells are designed to be shed. What remained were people who knew how to operate quietly, who understood the value of patience, and who recognized that survival sometimes means surrendering the symbol to preserve the substance. The Knights Templar did not think in terms of centuries when they began. But by the time their power peaked, they had learned to think beyond their own existence. This was not arrogance. It was realism. Every order ends. The question is whether anything remains. For the Templars, survival did not mean defying kings or fighting to the last man. It meant stepping back, dissolving into the fabric of society, and allowing the world to believe the story it wanted to hear. In doing so, they ensured that when the Order was finally declared dead, something of it was already elsewhere, alive, unremarkable, and untouchable. Not in banners or titles, but in people who understood the unwritten rules of survival. Power rarely announces its fear openly. Instead, it disguises anxiety as authority, insecurity as righteousness. By the early years of the 14th century, this quiet fear had settled deep into the courts of Europe, and nowhere was it more intense than in France. The Knights Templar, once celebrated as defenders of the faith, had become something far more unsettling to kings. Creditors with memory, influence, and independence. King Philip IV, later remembered as Philip the Fair, ruled a kingdom rich in appearance but hollow at its core. Wars against England and Flanders had drained the treasury. Lavish court expenses bled silver faster than taxes could replace it. Repeated attempts to debase the currency only worsened inflation and public unrest. The crown was desperate, and desperation sharpens resentment. The Templars stood at the center of this tension. They were not merely wealthy. They were indispensable. They safeguarded royal funds, managed transfers, and extended loans when no one else could. Their Paris temple was not just a fortress, but the financial heart of the kingdom. Kings trusted them with their gold because there was no safer place to put it. But trust, when mixed with dependency, breeds humiliation. Every coin borrowed was a reminder that royal authority had limits. Every ledger held by the Templars was a quiet assertion that power did not flow in only one direction. The Order answered to the Pope, not to the crown, placing it beyond Philip's direct control. In a time when monarchs were working tirelessly to centralize power, this independence was intolerable. Philip had faced similar problems before. He had expelled the Jews from France and seized their assets. He had moved against the Lombards. In each case, financial necessity had been wrapped in moral justification. The pattern was clear. When debt became unbearable, creditors became enemies. The Templars, however, were different. They could not be expelled quietly. Their reputation was sacred, their mission entwined with the Church itself. To move against them required not only force, but a narrative strong enough to justify sacrilege. This is where fear met opportunity. Rumors about the Order had circulated for years. Secret rituals, strange initiations, symbols misunderstood by outsiders. These whispers had never gained traction before, dismissed as jealousy or ignorance. But in Philip's court they were suddenly useful. Heresy was the one crime that could dissolve privilege, silence opposition, and rally public support all at once. The king did not act alone. His advisors, lawyers, and clergy carefully constructed a case that transformed financial grievance into moral outrage. The Templars were no longer creditors. They were corrupters of faith. No longer protectors, they were traitors to Christ. The brilliance of the strategy lay in its simplicity. By attacking belief, Philip avoided addressing money. Debts vanished beneath accusations. Confiscation could be framed as purification. And the crown, cast as defender of orthodoxy, emerged not as a thief, but as a savior. Yet beneath the theater, something more personal simmered. Philip was a king who believed deeply in absolute authority. He had clashed with popes, imprisoned bishops, and reshaped the relationship between church and state in France. The Templars, by existing outside this framework, represented a challenge to his vision of order. They were a reminder that not all power flowed from the throne. Their international network only deepened this anxiety. The Templars moved wealth across borders effortlessly. They maintained loyalty to a structure that transcended national identity. In an age when kings sought to bind subjects tightly to emerging nation-states, this transnational allegiance felt dangerous. To Philip, the Templars were not merely wealthy monks. They were a state within a state, and states do not tolerate rivals. The irony is that the Templars had never sought to challenge royal authority openly. They benefited from stability. They thrived under predictable rule. But neutrality itself can be threatening when rulers demand submission. The order's refusal to bend, to become an instrument of the crown, sealed its fate. What followed was less a trial than a performance. Confessions were extracted, testimonies shaped, and evidence interpreted through a predetermined lens. The king's agents moved with urgency, as if afraid that hesitation might allow the truth to complicate the story being told. But even as Philip pressed forward, he faced resistance from Rome. Pope Clement V was cautious, conflicted, and painfully aware of the precedent being set. To condemn the Templars outright was to admit that the Church had sanctioned heresy for centuries. To defend them was to challenge a powerful king. Clement hesitated, delayed, negotiated. His uncertainty speaks volumes. It suggests that even at the highest levels of the Church, the case against the Templars was far from clear. Yet political pressure is relentless. Philip summoned councils, threatened schism, and made it clear that inaction would have consequences. Gradually, reluctantly, the papacy yielded. The order was suppressed not because guilt was proven, but because its continued existence had become inconvenient. In this sense, the fall of the Templars was not a moral judgment, but a financial and political settlement. And like many such settlements, it was incomplete. Philip seized what he could. Lands, buildings, and movable goods were claimed. But much of the order's wealth was entangled in obligations, trusts, and long-term arrangements that could not be easily unraveled. Money loaned was money owed, but destroying the lender did not erase the debt's history. The king expected relief. What he found instead was complexity. Worse still, destroying the Templars did not solve France's financial problems. The crown remained indebted, unstable, and increasingly authoritarian. The scapegoat had been sacrificed, but the underlying issues endured. This raises an uncomfortable question. If the goal was financial liberation, why proceed with such violence and haste? The answer may lie not in economics alone, but in fear of exposure. The longer the Templars existed, the more they knew. About royal finances, about private dealings, about compromises and secrets that kings preferred forgotten. Eliminating the order meant eliminating a repository of inconvenient memory. But memory, like wealth, is difficult to confiscate when it lives in people rather than records. The destruction of the Templars removed a visible threat, but it did not erase the networks they had built. Families who had worked with the order for generations did not suddenly forget their connections. Knowledge of routes, accounts, and alliances did not vanish with the closing of commandery doors. In attempting to free himself from debt, Philip may have ensured that the story of the Templars would never truly end. By turning them into martyrs and mysteries, he guaranteed their survival in rumor, legend, and unanswered questions. The king died only a few years later, his reign marked by conflict and instability. The Templars, officially erased, lived on in whispers. And at the heart of those whispers was a simple, enduring truth. The greatest threat to power is not opposition, but dependency. The Knights Templar had become indispensable, and for that they had to be destroyed. The morning arrived with cruel precision. Across France, in cities, villages, and remote strongholds, the same ritual unfolded almost simultaneously, as if time itself had been briefly unified for a single purpose. Messengers delivered sealed orders to local officials late the night before, with strict instructions not to break the wax until dawn. Those orders carried the authority of the king, and they allowed no hesitation. When the seals were broken, the message was always the same. Arrest them all. Not after questioning. Not after negotiation. Immediately. In Paris, the temple fortress still stood as it had for decades, its thick walls guarding not only men but memory, wealth, and reputation. The knights inside had no reason to expect betrayal from the crown they had served so faithfully. Many had slept peacefully, believing that whatever political storms gathered beyond the walls would pass, as they always had. The order had weathered criticism before. It had survived wars, defeats, and papal inquiries. This felt no different. They were wrong. Royal agents entered with soldiers, their movements efficient and unceremonious. There was no declaration of war, no chance to resist. Knights were roused from their beds, some still pulling on tunics as shackles closed around their wrists. Weapons were confiscated. Doors were locked behind them. Confusion spread quickly, followed by an uneasy silence as the realization settled that this was not a misunderstanding. Across the countryside, the same scene repeated. Commanderies that had stood for generations were overrun in moments. Brothers who had shared prayers and meals for decades were separated, loaded onto carts, and driven toward prisons they had never imagined entering. Some asked questions. Few received answers. The coordination was astonishing. In an age without modern communication, the arrests were carried out with near-perfect timing. This alone suggests months of preparation, careful secrecy, and an intimate knowledge of the order's locations and routines. Someone had been watching. Someone had planned for this. The charges, when finally read aloud, felt deliberately surreal. The knights were accused of denying Christ, worshipping false idols, spitting on the cross during initiation rituals, and engaging in acts too obscene to repeat publicly. The accusations were designed not merely to condemn, but to shock. They painted the Templars as monsters hiding behind holy symbols. To the knights, the words must have sounded like fragments from a nightmare. Many had devoted their entire adult lives to a discipline defined by restraint. Their rituals were solemn, repetitive, and rooted in prayer. To be told that these practices were now being reinterpreted as blasphemy was to watch reality itself be twisted. But the accusations were never meant to withstand scrutiny. They were meant to overwhelm. Interrogations began almost immediately. The machinery of confession was already in place. Torture was not an aberration. It was a tool refined and methodical. Men were stretched, burned, deprived of sleep, and broken piece by piece. Under such conditions, truth becomes meaningless. Survival dictates speech. Some confessed to everything. Others confessed to parts. A few resisted and paid with their lives. When torture stopped, many recanted, insisting that their words had been forced from them. These recantations were carefully ignored. What mattered was that the story now existed. Public opinion shifted with frightening speed. Fear and fascination mingled. The idea that a secretive, powerful order had hidden dark rituals behind closed doors appealed to the imagination. The same secrecy that had once inspired trust now fueled suspicion. The Templars' silence, enforced by imprisonment, made defense impossible. And yet, amid the chaos, there was a detail that passed largely unnoticed. The arrests targeted knights, priests, and officials of the order. They did not target households. They did not target families connected to the Templars. Servants were questioned and released. Tenants continued working the land. Local allies were largely left alone unless they held formal positions. This was not indiscriminate destruction. It was selective. If the aim had been to eliminate every trace of Templar influence, the net would have been wider. Instead, it was focused narrowly on the visible structure of the order. The men who wore the mantle were taken. The world around them remained largely intact. This selectivity suggests something crucial. The king's objective was not chaos, but control. By removing the leadership and discrediting the institution, Philip neutralized the Templars without provoking widespread rebellion. Local economies continued to function. Land remained productive. The social fabric was disturbed, but not torn apart. The trials dragged on for years. Councils were convened. Testimonies were collected, contradicted, and selectively interpreted. The Pope hesitated, then intervened, then retreated. The process was slow, messy, and deeply political. Through it all, the Templars waited. Some were held in isolation. Others were grouped together, forbidden to speak freely. Time passed strangely in these conditions, marked not by campaigns or prayers, but by interrogations and silence. The men who survived the early months faced a new kind of endurance test, one that required patience rather than courage. Outside the prisons, something else was happening. Templar properties were inventoried. Documents were seized. Accounts were examined. But what officials found did not match expectations. The order was wealthy, yes, but its wealth was distributed, invested, and often pledged. Much of it existed as obligations rather than treasure. There was no single hoard waiting to be claimed. Ships once associated with the Templars were missing. Records hinted at transfers made shortly before the arrests. Some commanderies appeared oddly prepared, as if certain assets had already been moved. This fueled rumors that would never disappear. Had the Templars known? Had word reached them despite the secrecy? Or had the order long ago accepted that its end was inevitable and planned accordingly? The execution of Jacques de Molay in 1314 was meant to be a final punctuation mark. The aging Grand Master, burned at the stake on an island in the Seine, reportedly proclaimed his innocence and called upon God to judge those who had wronged him. Legends would later claim he cursed the king and pope, both of whom died within the year. Whether the curse was real matters less than why the story endured. It endured because the ending felt incomplete. The order was officially dissolved. Its name was erased. Its symbols were banned. And yet, the sense that something had slipped away remained strong. The trials had destroyed the shell, but they had not satisfied the hunger for closure. The speed of the arrests, the narrow focus of the accusations, and the unresolved questions about wealth and continuity all pointed to a truth that was difficult to articulate. The fall of the Templars was too efficient to be total. Efficiency implies design. If the order had truly been caught off guard, its collapse would have been chaotic. Resistance would have flared. Secrets would have spilled. Instead, there was silence, endurance, and an unsettling absence of panic. It is possible that the Templars believed survival did not require public defense, that the institution could be sacrificed if something else endured. When historians speak of the destruction of the Knights Templar, they often describe an ending. But endings are rarely so clean. More often, they are transitions disguised as conclusions. The arrests of October 1307 marked the disappearance of the order from the visible stage of history. What happened after? Quiet movements, new allegiances, families absorbing former knights under different names, was not recorded with the same drama. History remembers flames. It forgets what walked away in the shadows while everyone was watching the fire. After the arrests came the accounting. Kings and clerks expected revelation. Vaults thrown open, chests of silver dragged into daylight, the sudden transformation of royal poverty into abundance. The destruction of the order had been justified, in part, by the promise of reclaimed wealth. The Templars were said to be unimaginably rich. Their end, many believed, would solve everything. It did not. When royal officials entered former Templar strongholds, what they found was unsettlingly ordinary. Inventories listed lands, buildings, livestock, tools, and records of rents owed. There was money, certainly, but not in the quantities imagined by rumor. No mountains of gold. No hidden hoards glittering beneath stone floors. The wealth of the Templars, it turned out, was largely invisible, spread across obligations, loans, deposits, and long-term arrangements that did not fit neatly into wagons bound for the treasury. This was the first sign that something fundamental had been misunderstood. The Templars were not hoarders. They were managers. Their power came not from what they possessed outright, but from what they controlled through trust. They held deposits for nobles. They safeguarded church funds. They extended credit. Much of the wealth associated with the order did not belong to them at all. It belonged to others who trusted them to keep it safe. Destroying the institution did not magically transfer ownership. Worse still, many records were incomplete. Some were missing altogether. In several commanderies, ledgers ended abruptly months before the arrests. Transfers were noted without clear destinations. Ships once registered to Templar ports were absent from harbors, their whereabouts unrecorded. Officials muttered about incompetence. Privately, some suspected something more deliberate. The silence was louder than any confession extracted under torture. This absence fueled speculation almost immediately. Stories began to circulate of ships leaving under cover of night, of treasure loaded hastily and sent toward unknown destinations. Some claimed the Templars had fled to Scotland. Others whispered of Iberian ports, or even lands beyond the western horizon. These stories would grow more elaborate with time, but at their core was a simple observation. The expected evidence was missing. Smoke had risen, ashes had fallen, but the fire had not consumed everything. The Crown attempted to assert control by redistributing former Templar properties to rival orders, most notably the Hospitallers. On paper, this looked like resolution. In practice, it created confusion. Many lands were tied up in disputes. Local families challenged transfers. Tenants resisted new authorities, loyal not to distant institutions but to familiar arrangements. The order may have been dissolved, but its imprint on local life remained stubbornly present. In some regions, former Templar administrators simply continued their work under new titles. In others, estates changed hands but not habits. The same stewards managed the same lands, collecting rents from the same families. Only the seals on documents had changed. This continuity unsettled royal officials. They had expected transformation. Instead, they found persistence. The question of missing wealth became increasingly awkward. Philip's financial situation did not improve. If anything, it worsened. The promised windfall failed to materialize, undermining the justification for the purge. Publicly, this was explained away as necessary sacrifice. Privately, frustration grew. Where had it gone? One answer is that there was never a single treasure to find. The legend of vast hidden riches owes more to later imagination than to medieval reality. But this explanation does not account for the deliberate gaps in records, the missing ships, or the speed with which some assets seemed to vanish from view. The Templars were meticulous planners. They did not leave matters of importance to chance. If they anticipated danger, they would have acted quietly and early. The absence of chaos in their financial collapse suggests forethought rather than surprise. It is also worth noting what was not confiscated. Certain lands passed smoothly into private hands with little resistance. Certain families emerged from the aftermath strangely unscathed, even strengthened. They acquired properties, titles, and influence in the decades following the suppression, often in regions once dominated by Templar commanderies. This does not prove conspiracy, but it does suggest continuity. The destruction of the order created a vacuum, and vacuums are rarely left unfilled. The knowledge of how to manage estates, move funds, and navigate political complexity did not disappear with the Templars' name. It migrated. The idea that the order's true wealth was not gold but expertise becomes increasingly compelling. Banking systems, logistical networks, and trusted relationships cannot be burned at the stake. They survive in people. If this is true, then the disappearance of material treasure is less mysterious. Wealth was not hidden. It was transformed. investments shifted, obligations were renegotiated. Control passed quietly to those positioned to receive it. Families, not institutions, are best suited to such transitions. They can absorb change without drawing attention. They can adapt identities, allegiances, and even beliefs. Unlike orders, they do not require papal approval to exist. They endure through inheritance, memory, and silence. The smoke of the Templar fires may have obscured this transformation, but it did not erase it. Legends would later exaggerate these events into tales of lost gold and secret vaults. Such stories are seductive because they offer simple answers to complex questions. But the reality is likely subtler and more unsettling. What vanished was not treasure, but visibility. The Order's assets did not need to be buried if they could be dissolved into the everyday workings of society. A loan forgiven here, property transferred there. A marriage alliance securing land that once belonged to the Order. These are not dramatic acts, but they are effective ones. Over time, memory faded. New generations inherited property without knowing its full history. Or perhaps they knew and chose not to speak. Silence, after all, had proven its value. The crown moved on. Wars continued. New crises demanded attention. The mystery of the missing wealth became a footnote, then a curiosity, then a legend. But legends persist because they touch something unresolved. If the Templars truly had nothing left, if their destruction had been complete and their power illusory, the story would have ended cleanly. It did not. Instead, it lingered, growing stranger with each retelling. This lingering unease suggests that something fundamental escaped the accounting. The fire burned brightly, but it did not consume the roots. What remained after the smoke cleared was a landscape altered, but not emptied. The symbols were gone. The name was erased. Yet beneath the surface, familiar patterns continued. The Knights Templar had vanished from sight, but whatever they had built did not vanish with them. It simply learned how to exist without being seen. History has always been more careful with martyrs than with their descendants. It remembers those who burn, those who confess, those who defy power in dramatic final moments. What it rarely records are the lives that continue afterward, the quiet ones, shaped by absence, secrecy, and survival. In the aftermath of the Templars' fall, this selective memory becomes especially pronounced. The knights were named, tried, and condemned. But if there were children, they were never meant to be part of the story. Officially, there were none. The Order insisted on chastity. Chroniclers repeated it. Later historians accepted it. The narrative was neat and convenient. An order of men without wives, without heirs, without biological legacy. When they were destroyed, nothing remained but ruins and rumors. Yet the medieval world was not neat, and it rarely cooperated with official narratives. Across Europe, there are scattered hints of children whose origins are curiously undefined. Boys fostered in households closely tied to former Templar estates. Girls raised in convents with generous, unexplained patronage. Young people whose education and advancement seem disproportionate to their documented family status. On their own, these details mean little. Together, they suggest a pattern of quiet protection. In medieval society, children were often raised away from their birth parents. Fosterage was a tool of alliance, a way to bind families together and ensure loyalty across generations. A child's biological parentage could be obscured without scandal, especially if discretion served everyone involved. In this context, the idea of children connected to Templars being raised under different names is not extraordinary. It is practical. Women were central to this system, though history rarely grants them agency. Noblewomen, widows, and members of religious houses had the social flexibility to absorb children without inviting suspicion. A child brought into a convent or noble household could be explained as an orphan, a ward, or a distant relative. Questions were rarely asked, and answers were rarely required. What mattered was not origin, but outcome. Children raised in proximity to Templar communities would have absorbed a particular worldview. They would have learned discipline, caution, and the importance of silence. They would have known that certain questions were not to be asked, certain histories not to be spoken aloud. This was not indoctrination in the dramatic sense but cultural inheritance, the quiet passing on of habits and values. The suppression of the order created urgency. Knights were imprisoned or executed. Those who survived were stripped of status and scattered. If there were children connected to them, protecting those children became a priority that could not be acknowledged publicly. Records from the period are telling in their omissions. In some regions, baptismal and household records grow vague just when clarity would be expected. Names change spelling. Lineages begin without explanation. Families appear in documents fully formed, with land and influence but little recorded past. These gaps frustrate historians, but they also speak volumes. If the goal had been to erase the Templars completely, these children would have been liabilities. Yet they were not targeted. They were not questioned. They were not mentioned. The silence suggests either ignorance or deliberate avoidance. Given the thoroughness of the trials, ignorance seems unlikely. It is more plausible that these children were not seen as threats. Without the mantle, without formal ties to the order, they were invisible. And invisibility was protection. Over time, these children grew into adults who navigated the world differently from those bound by institutional identity. They were not knights. They did not swear vows. They did not attract scrutiny. Yet they carried something intangible, a familiarity with networks, with discretion, with the value of trust over declaration. Some entered the clergy. Others married into minor nobility. A few became administrators, merchants, or local officials. None of these paths would have raised suspicion. In fact, they were ideal positions from which to preserve influence quietly. What they inherited was not a title, but a way of operating. This perspective reframes the idea of a lost bloodline. It suggests not a single family tracing its ancestry proudly back to the Templars, but many lines dispersed deliberately, diluted enough to survive. The goal was not recognition, but continuity. Legends often imagine a secret chosen heir, a dramatic lineage passed down intact. Reality is rarely so theatrical. Survival favors redundancy. Multiple lines are safer than one. Silence is safer than proclamation. The absence of named heirs in Templar records may not indicate their non-existence, but rather the success of a strategy designed to leave no trail. Critics argue that this interpretation relies too heavily on absence and inference. They caution against filling historical gaps with imagination. This caution is valid, but it must be balanced against an understanding of how power behaves under threat. When institutions fall, they protect what they value most. For the Templars, that was not land or gold alone, but knowledge and relationships. Children raised within those relationships would have been natural custodians of that inheritance, even if they never knew the full extent of it. There is also the emotional dimension to consider. The Knights were not abstractions. They were men who had lived, loved in whatever ways they were permitted, and aged within a rigid system. To imagine that they would accept extinction without concern for what came after them is to misunderstand human nature. Protecting children does not require breaking every vow. It requires compassion, foresight, and trust in others. These are not qualities absent from the historical record of the order. As decades passed, memory softened. The danger associated with the Templar name faded. What remained were families whose origins were quietly forgotten, even by themselves. Over generations, stories became fragmented, reduced to hints and traditions without context. This forgetting was not failure. It was success. The most secure secrets are those no longer recognized as secrets at all. By the time legends of hidden bloodlines began to circulate centuries later, they were already distorted. What had once been practical arrangements became myth. Children raised under different names became lost heirs. Ordinary continuity became mystery. And yet, the persistence of these legends suggests that something real lay beneath them. History did not record the children of the Knights Templar because history was not meant to. Records serve power. Silence serves survival. The Knights burned. The order fell. But children grew up. They married, worked, prayed, and died without ever appearing in chronicles. Their lives did not make history, but they carried it forward in ways that history struggles to measure. If the legacy of the Templars endured, it did not do so through banners or battles. It did so through people whose names were never written down, whose origins were never questioned, and whose quiet existence ensured that the story did not truly end when the fires went out. History remembers the end. It forgets what began again in the shadows. When the papal bulls were issued and the fate of the Knights Templar was sealed across much of Europe, one kingdom stood apart in quiet defiance. Scotland, rugged and war-scarred, did not respond as expected. There were no mass arrests, no public trials, no burning of mantles in town squares. Instead, there was silence, and silence in moments like these can be a form of resistance. At the heart of this anomaly stood a king already condemned by Rome. Robert the Bruce had been excommunicated for his rebellion against English rule, branded an outlaw by both crown and church. To him, papal authority carried little practical weight. Survival mattered more than obedience, and alliances were forged not on doctrine, but on necessity. Scotland in the early 14th century was not a stable kingdom. It was a land in flux, defined by shifting loyalties, clan rivalries, and constant warfare. Bruce's grip on the throne was far from secure. He needed experienced fighters, disciplined administrators, and men who understood strategy beyond brute force. In this context, former Templars were not liabilities, they were assets. The Templars had long maintained properties in Scotland, though they were fewer and less prominent than in France. Their presence was subtle, often embedded within existing noble estates rather than standing apart. This made them easier to overlook and harder to target. When the arrests began elsewhere, there was no urgency in Scotland to act. The machinery of suppression simply failed to engage. Some knights may have arrived as fugitives, crossing borders under assumed names. Others may have already been there, living quietly in service to local lords. The chaos of the Scottish Wars of Independence provided ideal cover. Records were sparse. Allegiances shifted. Men disappeared and reappeared under different banners all the time. What mattered was loyalty in battle. Scottish tradition holds that Templar knights fought alongside Robert the Bruce at Bannockburn in 1314, turning the tide against a larger English force. Whether this is literal truth or symbolic memory is debated, but the persistence of the story is revealing. It speaks to a belief that trained, disciplined warriors with no allegiance to England or Rome played a decisive role in Scotland's survival. Even if the image of white-clad knights charging into battle is romanticized, the underlying reality remains plausible. Veterans of the Crusades and European conflicts would have brought invaluable experience. They would have understood logistics, fortification, and morale. In a guerrilla war against a powerful enemy, such knowledge was priceless. Scotland offered something else the rest of Europe could not: distance from centralized authority. Its political fragmentation, often seen as weakness, became a shield. Clans governed themselves. Local power mattered more than royal decree. A man's worth was measured by loyalty and usefulness, not by papal opinion. This environment was uniquely hospitable to those seeking to disappear. Families connected to former Templars could settle in remote regions, integrating into clan structures that valued kinship and mutual defense. Names could change. Identities could merge. Over time, the distinction between newcomer and native blurred. Unlike in France, where lineage was meticulously recorded and scrutinized, Scottish genealogies were oral, fluid, and often retrospective. They were shaped by memory rather than documentation. This allowed histories to be rewritten without erasing truth, only reshaping it. Several Scottish clans later developed legends of ancient foreign origins, of warriors who arrived from distant lands and became foundational figures. While such stories are common in many cultures, their timing and consistency in regions associated with Templar properties invite curiosity. Again, there is no single document that confirms the survival of Templar bloodlines in Scotland. What exists instead is a convergence of circumstances: political defiance of Rome, need for experienced fighters, geographic isolation, and social structures that absorbed outsiders seamlessly. Portugal followed a similar path through official transformation, but Scotland did so informally, without papal approval or new orders. This made its version of survival less visible, and therefore more durable. The absence of persecution allowed former Templars to age, marry, and integrate without fear. If children were born, they were born into a society that valued strength and loyalty over ancestry. Their past mattered less than their present usefulness. Over generations, any explicit connection to the order would have faded. What remained were families whose traditions emphasized secrecy, resilience, and independence. Traits once necessary for survival became cultural identity. This long, quiet integration challenges the idea that the Templars simply vanished. It suggests instead that geography played a crucial role in determining who lived openly and who did not. In France, central authority crushed resistance swiftly. In Scotland, fragmentation created refuge. History tends to follow power. It records the actions of kings and popes, not the slow movements of families across borders. As a result, Scotland appears as a blank space in the narrative of the Templars' fall. But blank spaces are rarely empty. They are simply places where the story continued without witnesses. By the time Scotland stabilized politically and re-entered broader European affairs, the moment had passed. The urgency that had driven the persecution was gone. Former Templars were no longer fugitives. They were landholders, warriors, and clan members whose origins were no longer questioned. If the order had planned for survival beyond its own destruction, Scotland would have been an obvious choice. Not because it was powerful, but because it was overlooked. Not because it was unified, but because it was chaotic. Chaos, for those who understand it, can be shelter. The story of the Templars in Scotland is not one of dramatic resurrection or secret dominion. It is a story of absorption, of identities dissolving into the fabric of a place that valued survival over orthodoxy. The white mantle may have disappeared, but the men beneath it did not simply cease to exist. They became Scots, and in doing so, they ensured that whatever the order had been, it was not entirely lost to history, only transformed beyond recognition. While some kingdoms chose silence and neglect, Portugal chose something far more deliberate. Where France burned and Scotland absorbed, Portugal transformed. The fate of the Knights Templar there unfolded not as a violent rupture, but as a legal and symbolic sleight of hand, so elegant that it almost passed unnoticed. At the time of the suppression, Portugal was a young kingdom still defining itself. Its rulers had fought long wars against Muslim powers, and in those struggles the Templars had been indispensable. They fortified borders, governed frontier lands, and provided military expertise that few others could match. Their loyalty to the Portuguese crown had been consistent and deeply practical. Unlike in France, where suspicion had grown, in Portugal the order was seen as a stabilizing force. When papal orders arrived demanding the arrest of Templars and the seizure of their properties, King Dinis faced a choice. Obedience would weaken his defenses and disrupt a carefully balanced system of land and loyalty. Defiance risked conflict with Rome. Dinis chose neither path completely. Instead, he redefined the problem. The king argued that while the order as an institution might be dissolved, the men who served it were not criminals. They had committed no heresy in Portugal. They had defended the faith and the kingdom faithfully. To punish them would be unjust and destabilizing. This distinction between the name of the order and the individuals within it became the foundation of Portugal's solution. Through negotiation and delay, Dinis bought time. Trials were held, but they were restrained. Accusations were examined carefully, not theatrically. Confessions did not flow as they had in France. Most importantly, there was no rush to dismantle what already worked. Then came the transformation. In 1319, with papal approval, the Order of Christ was established. On paper, it was a new institution distinct from the Knights Templar. In practice, it was a continuation. The same lands, the same castles, the same men, now operating under a different name and symbol. The Red Cross changed shape, but the structure beneath it remained. This was not resistance to Rome, but compliance through reinvention. By allowing the papacy to declare the Templars dissolved while simultaneously preserving their assets and personnel, Portugal satisfied both political necessity and practical reality. The Order of Christ became a vessel into which the Templars were quietly poured, their past erased by administrative language. What makes this transformation so significant is not that it happened, but how openly it was accepted. There was no attempt to hide the continuity. Everyone involved understood what was occurring. And yet, because it was framed as reform rather than defiance, it faced little opposition. This suggests that the threat posed by the Templars was not universal. It depended on context. In France, where financial tension and centralized authority clashed with Templar independence, destruction was necessary. In Portugal, where the order served the crown's interests, preservation was logical. The Order of Christ inherited not only property and personnel, but institutional memory. Administrative methods, military strategies, and financial practices passed seamlessly into the new organization. This continuity would have profound consequences in the centuries to follow. Under the Order of Christ, Portugal entered its age of exploration. Prince Henry the Navigator, one of the most influential figures of the era, served as Grand Master of the Order. The same systems once used to manage Crusader logistics were now applied to funding voyages into the unknown. The connection is striking. Ships that once sailed toward the Holy Land now ventured down the African coast. Fortresses built to defend borders became launch points for global expansion. The order that had once guarded pilgrims now guarded navigators. If the Templars had prepared for survival beyond their original mission, this was it. Not survival in hiding, but survival through evolution. The Order of Christ demonstrates that the end of the Templars was not inevitable everywhere. Where rulers valued continuity over spectacle, the Order's legacy could be preserved openly. This undermines the idea that the suppression was purely a moral reckoning. It reveals it as a political choice. For the men involved, the transformation was profound. They did not need to flee or assume new identities. They remained where they were, doing what they had always done, only under a different banner. Their skills were validated rather than condemned. And yet, even here, discretion mattered. While the institutional continuity was clear, individual histories were quietly reset. The narrative moved forward, not backward. The Templar past was acknowledged only insofar as it served legitimacy. Personal connections, family ties, and informal arrangements remained unspoken. The Order of Christ did not ask uncomfortable questions about what came before. It did not need to. Its purpose was forward-looking, not retrospective. This selective memory ensured stability. By focusing on function rather than origin, Portugal avoided the fractures seen elsewhere. The transformation was smooth precisely because it refused to dwell on what might provoke conflict. For those interested in bloodlines and legacy, Portugal offers a rare glimpse of what survival might look like when it is not forced underground. The same men, potentially the same families, continued to operate within a recognized structure. Children born into these circles would have grown up with inherited roles, even if the origin of those roles was no longer discussed. Over generations, the distinction between Templar and Christ order blurred into irrelevance. What remained was a tradition of service, secrecy, and adaptability. Portugal's solution stands as a counterpoint to the drama of persecution. It shows that the destruction of the Templars was not a universal moral necessity, but a context-driven outcome. Where fear dominated, the order was crushed. Where pragmatism prevailed, it was preserved. This raises an important question. If the Templars could survive so completely in Portugal through official channels, how much more easily might they have survived elsewhere through unofficial ones? The Order of Christ is not a hidden secret. It is a historical fact. Yet its existence challenges the narrative of total annihilation. It proves that the skills, networks, and perhaps even the families associated with the Templars did not simply vanish in the early 14th century. They adapted, and in doing so, they shaped the future of a nation that would soon reshape the world. The white mantle may have been retired, but the legacy it carried sailed on under a different flag into history's next chapter. Stone endures when banners fall. Long after names are erased and symbols forbidden, walls remain, embedded in the landscape, quietly shaping the lives that pass through them. The Knights Templar understood this better than most. Their power was never only spiritual or military, it was architectural. They built not just for war, but for continuity. Across Europe, Templar structures were designed with an unusual blend of strength and adaptability. Commanderies, farms, fortresses, and chapels were placed strategically along trade routes, borders, and fertile lands. These were not temporary camps. They were meant to last, to anchor the order's presence for generations. Each stone was laid with an understanding that power, once rooted, could persist even if its name changed. When the order was dissolved, these places did not crumble overnight. They were repurposed, renamed, reassigned. But the people who lived and worked around them remained the same. The rhythm of daily life, planting, harvesting, managing livestock, maintaining roads, continued uninterrupted. Stone does not recognize papal decrees. This continuity created an opportunity. Former Templar estates were often vast, self-sufficient systems. They included arable land, water sources, workshops, and housing for laborers. Whoever controlled these estates controlled not just property, but local economies. Transitioning ownership on paper did not immediately change this reality. Authority was exercised through familiarity, not documentation. In many cases, the same families who had worked these lands under Templar oversight continued to do so after the order's fall. They knew the terrain, the people, the obligations. New owners, whether royal officials or rival orders, often relied on them for stability. This reliance quietly preserved existing power structures. Within these estates, identity was fluid. Titles mattered less than function. A man who managed land effectively retained his position, regardless of whose seal adorned the charter. Over time, stewardship became hereditary, not by law but by practice. Sons replaced fathers because it made sense, not because it was written. This is how legacy survives without proclamation. Castles, in particular, played a crucial role. Templar fortresses were built to defend borders and control movement. After the suppression, many were absorbed into royal or noble holdings. But their strategic value did not change. They remained centers of authority, drawing families of influence into their orbit. Living within or near such a fortress conferred status and protection. It also fostered a sense of belonging to something older than any current ruler. Generations grew up under the same walls, hearing stories that blended history and myth, until the distinction between the two blurred. The idea that families associated with these sites might preserve elements of Templar culture is not far-fetched. Architecture shapes behavior. Living within a disciplined, fortified environment encourages certain habits: order, vigilance, restraint. These habits, passed down unconsciously, become tradition. Stone also preserves secrecy. Templar buildings were designed with hidden chambers, secure storage, and controlled access. These features were practical in times of war, but they also allowed for discretion. Records could be stored, valuables hidden, meetings conducted out of sight. After the order's fall, such spaces did not lose their usefulness. It is tempting to imagine secret vaults filled with treasure. The reality was likely more mundane, but no less significant. Documents, contracts, and knowledge of networks would have been far more valuable than gold. Such information could guide future decisions, protect assets, and maintain influence quietly. The rural nature of many Templar estates further aided this process. Remote locations attracted less scrutiny. Life moved at a slower pace. Outsiders were noticed immediately, while insiders blended into familiar patterns. In such environments, continuity thrived. Over time, these estates became seeds of local nobility. Families who controlled land and resources naturally rose in status. Their authority was grounded not in royal favor, but in economic reality. They provided employment, protection, and stability. Loyalty followed naturally. As centuries passed, the original Templar connection faded from memory. What remained were families whose prominence seemed ancient, whose roots were assumed to stretch back into an indistinct past. Their origin stories, if they existed at all, were vague and unexamined. This vagueness was a shield. History tends to focus on dramatic change. It records revolutions, wars, and decrees. It overlooks the slow accumulation of influence that occurs when nothing appears to happen. Templar estates, quietly transitioning through names and owners, exemplify this overlooked continuity. The relationship between stone and blood becomes clearer in this light. Architecture provides the stage. Families provide the actors. As long as the stage remains, the performance can continue, even if the script changes. This interplay explains why certain regions associated with the Templars retained unusual autonomy long after the order's demise. Local customs persisted. Authority was exercised locally. External control remained nominal. These areas had been trained, for generations, to operate semi-independently. The fall of the Templars did not erase this training. Instead, it freed it from institutional oversight. What had once been coordinated through an order became dispersed among families who understood the system intimately. The result was not chaos, but decentralization. This decentralization mirrors the survival strategies seen elsewhere. In Scotland, integration into clan structures achieved a similar effect. In Portugal, institutional continuity did the work. In other regions, stone and land became the vessels of memory. The image of a knight planting his sword and founding a dynasty is romantic, but misleading. Legacy is rarely so direct. It is built slowly, through management, marriage, and memory, through decisions that prioritize stability over recognition. The Knights Templar built in stone because they believed in endurance. They could not have predicted the exact form that endurance would take, but they understood its principles. Control the land. Shape the environment. Trust that people, given stability, will carry forward what they know. When historians search for the Templars' legacy and find only ruins, they may be looking in the wrong place. Ruins are the visible remains. The invisible ones live on in patterns of ownership, local authority, and family prominence. Stone does not speak, but it teaches. Those who lived within Templar-built spaces learned lessons about order, secrecy, and resilience. They passed those lessons on not as doctrine, but as habit. And habits, once embedded, are remarkably difficult to erase. Long after the white mantle was outlawed, the structures it had inhabited continued to shape the world around them. In their shadows, families grew, adapted, and endured. The order was gone, but the ground it had claimed, and the lives it had shaped upon that ground, ensured that something of it remained, quiet, rooted, and unseen. In the generations that followed the suppression of the Knights Templar, a curious phenomenon began to appear in the records of Europe. Families emerged into prominence with remarkable speed, already wealthy, already connected, already confident in their authority. They did not rise gradually through royal favor or battlefield glory. They simply appeared, as if they had always been there, waiting for history to notice them. Chroniclers often glossed over these origins. Genealogies began abruptly, with phrases that revealed more than they explained. Of unknown ancestry, long established, ancient, though records are scarce. Such language was not unusual in medieval documentation, but its frequency in regions once dominated by Templar estates is striking. In a world obsessed with lineage, unexplained lineage was an anomaly. Noble families usually fought to prove the antiquity of their blood. Charters were copied and recopied. Ancestors were embellished, sometimes invented. To possess land without a story was dangerous. And yet, these families did not seem troubled by the absence of documented origins. Their authority rested elsewhere. Often it rested in land. Former Templar territories reappear in later centuries under new family names, but with familiar boundaries. The estates are intact. The infrastructure remains. The surrounding villages continue to depend on the same center of power. Only the banner has changed. In some cases, the transfer is recorded. In others, it is assumed. Rarely is it questioned. What made these families different was not just what they owned, but how they operated. They were unusually adept at administration. Their estates were efficient. Their relationships with both church and crown were carefully balanced. They avoided open conflict, preferring negotiation and quiet influence. This behavior mirrors that of the Templars themselves. Unlike many noble houses, these families did not define themselves through constant warfare or conspicuous displays of power. They invested in stability. They married strategically, often into other quietly influential families rather than into the most visible dynasties. Their names appear repeatedly in legal documents, but rarely in chronicles of scandal or rebellion. This absence of drama is telling. History tends to remember those who disrupt. It forgets those who manage. The Templars had been masters of management, and it appears that this skill did not disappear with them. In regions like southern France, northern Italy, and parts of Iberia, the same pattern repeats. A family controls key land routes or economic hubs. They possess influence disproportionate to their recorded history. They are consulted by authorities, trusted with responsibility, and rarely challenged. When challenged, they respond not with force, but with paperwork. This bureaucratic competence suggests inheritance of knowledge, not coincidence. Administrative skill is not genetic, but it is cultural. It is taught, modeled, absorbed over time. Families who grew up within or alongside Templar systems would have internalized these methods naturally. The absence of a dramatic origin story may have been intentional. Claiming descent from the Templars would have invited suspicion, even centuries later. Silence was safer. Ambiguity allowed survival. Over time, ambiguity became tradition. Children raised in such families would have learned not to ask certain questions. Or if they did, they would have been given answers that satisfied without revealing. A distant ancestor, a lost document, a fire. These explanations are common because they work. What matters is not whether these families consciously preserved a Templar identity, but whether they preserved Templar habits. In that sense, bloodline is less important than behavior. This reframes the idea of secret families. It suggests not a hidden order operating in the shadows, but a diffusion of institutional culture into private life. The order dissolved, but its methods survived, distributed among families who had learned to thrive quietly. Critics rightly warn against romanticizing this pattern. Europe has always produced families of obscure origin who rose through luck, marriage, or patronage. Not every unexplained genealogy hides a secret past, but the concentration of such families around former Templar centers is difficult to ignore. It suggests correlation, if not direct causation. Moreover, these families often maintained unusual relationships with religious institutions. They were devout, but not ostentatious. They funded churches and monasteries without demanding prominence. Their piety was functional, not performative. This too echoes the Templars, whose faith emphasized discipline over display. As centuries passed, some of these families faded. Others rose higher. A few became entangled in the emerging structures of modern states, adapting once again to changing political landscapes. Through it all, their defining characteristic remained discretion. Discretion is a learned survival skill. The idea that history might contain blind spots is uncomfortable. It challenges the assumption that what we know is what mattered. But blind spots are inevitable in any system that records power selectively. The suppression of the Templars created one such blind spot. The focus on trials and executions drew attention away from what happened afterward. Families moved, adapted, and settled into new roles while historians were still debating guilt and innocence. By the time curiosity returned, the trail had gone cold. What remained were names without beginnings, estates without stories, and influence without explanation. These are not proofs, but they are traces. If the legacy of the Knights Templar survived, it did not do so as a single traceable lineage. It survived as a pattern, repeated often enough to leave an imprint, but never loudly enough to be confronted directly. Families are resilient because they can forget deliberately. They can allow stories to fade. They can choose which parts of the past to preserve and which to let dissolve into silence. In doing so, they become invisible to history's harsher judgments. The secret families of the Knights, if they existed, were not guardians of a grand revelation. They were guardians of normalcy, of land, routine, and quiet authority. Their success lay in becoming unremarkable. And that may be the most convincing evidence of all. What survives best is not what declares itself immortal, but what learns to blend so completely into the world that it no longer appears extraordinary. The Knights Templar vanished in flames and scandal, but the structures they built, social, economic, and cultural, did not require an order to persist. They required only people who knew how to live within them, and those people, whatever their names, continued on, unnoticed, unquestioned, and unrecorded, long after history turned the page. When institutions collapse, their symbols rarely disappear. They migrate. They shed their original meanings and take on new ones, carrying fragments of memory into unfamiliar contexts. In the centuries following the suppression of the Knights Templar, certain images began to reappear. Crosses altered in shape, tools reimagined as emblems, rituals reframed as moral instruction. None of these developments announced themselves as continuations. They did not need to. Their power lay in subtlety. One of the most enduring symbols associated with the Templars was the cross. Simple, stark, and unmistakable, it marked their presence across Europe and the Holy Land. After the Order's fall, the public display of this symbol became dangerous. To wear it openly was to invite suspicion. Yet the cross itself was not forbidden, only its association with the Order. This ambiguity created space for transformation. In Portugal, the cross was reshaped and absorbed into the insignia of the Order of Christ, continuing openly under papal sanction. Elsewhere, it appeared in altered forms, carved into stone, woven into heraldry, or stylized into patterns that escaped direct association. The symbol endured not as a declaration, but as a design. The same process occurred with tools and imagery linked to labor and construction. The Templars had been builders as much as warriors, erecting fortresses, churches, and infrastructure across continents. Their familiarity with geometry, measurement, and organization was practical, not mystical. Yet these skills carried symbolic weight. In later centuries, guilds of builders and craftsmen developed elaborate symbolic languages around tools like the compass, square, and level. These symbols represented moral order, balance, and structure. While it would be simplistic to claim direct descent from the Templars, the overlap in values and imagery invites reflection. What happens to institutional knowledge when its original framework is destroyed? It does not vanish. It finds new containers. The transition from crusading orders to fraternal organizations was gradual and unplanned. As warfare changed and centralized states reduced the need for private armies, the skills that once defined knightly orders, discipline, secrecy, mutual aid, became relevant in different contexts. Brotherhoods formed around shared professions, shared values, and shared rituals. These organizations were not military. They were social. They offered support, identity, and continuity in a rapidly changing world. Their members were often drawn from families with traditions of service, administration, or craftsmanship, precisely the environments where former Templar influence may have lingered. Secrecy, once a matter of survival, became a ritualized value. Initiations replaced vows. Symbols replaced uniforms. Knowledge was shared selectively, not because it was dangerous, but because it reinforced trust and cohesion. This shift from open power to symbolic power reflects a deeper transformation. The medieval world was giving way to early modernity. Authority was becoming centralized, codified, and bureaucratic. There was less space for autonomous institutions like the Templars, but there was still a need for networks that operated across borders, facilitated cooperation, and preserved shared values outside state control. Symbolic brotherhoods filled that need. The appeal of such groups lay in their ambiguity. They were not overtly political or religious. They could exist within multiple jurisdictions without threatening authority. Their symbols meant different things to different people, allowing insiders to recognize one another without attracting attention. This is not evidence of a secret plan or a hidden order directing events. It is evidence of cultural adaptation. People familiar with operating within disciplined, semi-autonomous systems gravitated toward structures that allowed similar dynamics in a safer form. Families that had once been connected to the Templars, whether through service, proximity, or shared culture, would have found these environments familiar. Their children, raised with an understanding of discretion and loyalty, would have navigated such spaces comfortably. Over time, the origin of these habits faded. What remained were traditions that felt ancient without being traceable. Symbols whose meanings were layered and flexible. Rituals that emphasized moral improvement rather than dogma. Critics often caution against linking the Templars too closely with later fraternal movements, arguing that such connections are speculative. They are right to be cautious. History does not move in straight lines. Influence is diffuse, not linear. But diffusion does not mean absence. The question is not whether the Templars secretly founded later organizations, but whether the cultural environment shaped by their rise and fall contributed to the emergence of new forms of association. In that sense, the answer seems clear. The suppression of the Templars created a vacuum. It demonstrated the danger of visible, independent power. Those who learned from this lesson adapted by becoming less visible. Symbols replaced structures. Ideas replaced territories. This adaptation ensured survival without confrontation. The language of symbols also allowed for continuity without accountability. Meanings could be reinterpreted. Origins could be forgotten. This protected both individuals and groups from scrutiny. It also allowed myths to flourish. As centuries passed, people began to project grand narratives onto these symbols, imagining hidden lineages and secret knowledge passed down intact. These stories say more about human fascination with mystery than about historical reality. And yet, they persist because they touch something true, that power can survive in altered forms, that institutions can dissolve while influence remains. The compass and square, the altered cross, the language of brotherhood, these are not proof of direct descent. They are echoes of a world where discipline, secrecy, and transnational loyalty were once embodied in a single order and later dispersed into many quieter forms. If the Knights Templar left a legacy, it was not a blueprint for domination, but a lesson in adaptation. When visibility becomes dangerous, meaning migrates. When symbols are stripped of authority, they gain flexibility. This flexibility allowed traditions to survive without drawing attention. It allowed families to pass on values without passing on names. It allowed memory to endure without being recorded. The cross became a pattern. The sword became a metaphor. The fortress became a moral framework. And through these transformations, something of the Templars' world continued, subtle, unclaimed, and largely invisible to history's official gaze. Not as knights, but as symbols quietly reshaped to fit a new age. History often frames power as something carried by men, recorded through their titles, wars, and decrees. Yet beneath those visible structures runs another current, quieter, more resilient, and far more difficult to erase. Bloodlines, when they survive, most often do so through women. In the story of the Knights Templar and what may have followed their fall, this truth becomes impossible to ignore. The official records of the order speak almost exclusively of men. Knights, commanders, masters. Women appear rarely, usually as donors or distant patrons. This absence has shaped the assumption that women played no role in whatever continuity may have existed. But absence from records does not mean absence from reality. It often means the opposite. Medieval women, particularly noble women and widows, occupied a strange position. They were constrained by law and custom, yet entrusted with immense responsibility. They managed estates, arranged marriages, oversaw households, and acted as guardians to children. In times of crisis, when men were imprisoned, killed, or disgraced, it was women who ensured survival. The suppression of the Templars created precisely such a crisis. Knights were arrested suddenly, often without warning. Estates were thrown into uncertainty. Children and dependents, if they existed, were left vulnerable. In this chaos, women became the stabilizing force. They negotiated with authorities, secured protection, and absorbed shock quietly. Their power lay in their invisibility. A woman taking in a child raised few questions. A widow managing land was expected. A convent accepting new novices did not invite scrutiny. These roles allowed women to move people and resources without attracting attention. In a world where male authority was public and confrontational, female authority was private and adaptive. If there were children connected to the Templars, women would have been their guardians. They would have decided where they were raised, what names they carried, which stories were told and which were not. They would have shaped identity not through proclamations, but through daily life. This is how bloodlines survive without being named. Marriage alliances further extended this quiet influence. Noblewomen married into families strategically, carrying land, dowries, and connections with them. These marriages often mattered more than military victories. Through them, property and influence changed hands in ways that left little trace of their deeper significance. A woman descended from or connected to a Templar network could bring that network into a new family without anyone ever recording the transfer. The past moved forward under a new name. Convents and religious houses played a particularly important role. They were centers of education, refuge, and record-keeping, often run by women who understood discretion. Girls raised in these environments learned discipline, literacy, and restraint. They also learned the value of silence. Religious life offered cover. A child's parentage mattered less within cloistered walls. Identity could be reshaped. History could be softened. In some cases, convents acted as holding spaces, places where children could be protected until circumstances allowed for safer integration into the world. This was not subversion. It was care. The emotional labor involved in this process is rarely acknowledged. Protecting children in a time of persecution required courage and sacrifice. Women bore the weight of uncertainty, knowing that a single mistake could expose those they were trying to shield. They also bore grief. Men burned at stakes. Orders dissolved. Names were cursed. Women lived on, carrying memory without recognition. They remembered not the glory, but the cost. Their silence was not ignorance, it was survival. Over generations, this silence became tradition. Stories were simplified. Origins were blurred. Children grew up without knowing the full truth of their ancestry, only that certain things were not discussed. This forgetting was not betrayal. It was the final act of protection. When later historians search for evidence of Templar bloodlines and find none, they may be encountering the success of this strategy. Bloodlines that announce themselves are easily targeted. Those that dissolve into ordinary life endure. Women ensured this dissolution. Even symbols passed through their hands differently. A cross embroidered discreetly into cloth. A name reused without explanation. A piece of land held in trust rather than claimed outright. These acts left no dramatic mark, but they shaped continuity. The narrative of male-dominated secrecy misses this entirely. It imagines hidden councils and grand conspiracies. The reality was likely far more domestic, far more human. Continuity was maintained not through oaths sworn in darkness, but through bedtime stories left untold, questions gently redirected, and choices made quietly at kitchen tables and in cloistered halls. This is why the story resists documentation. It lives in spaces history does not easily access. Private decisions, emotional bonds, and unrecorded acts of care. In this sense, the women connected to the Templars were not passive observers of history. They were its custodians. They decided what survived and what did not. They carried the future not as a banner, but as a responsibility. As time passed, their influence became invisible even to their descendants. Children married, moved, and settled into new lives. The past receded. What remained were values shaped by earlier choices, discretion, resilience, loyalty to people rather than institutions. These values feel ancient because they are. When myths later emerged about secret bloodlines and hidden heirs, they often overlooked this reality. They imagined power preserved through dominance rather than care, through revelation rather than concealment. But survival is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, patient, and often female. If the Knights Templar left descendants, those descendants did not survive because of swords or gold. They survived because women chose silence over pride, protection over recognition, and continuity over memory. And in doing so, they ensured that whatever had been worth saving did not die with the order. It lived on in lives shaped quietly, carried forward without names, and absorbed so completely into the fabric of society that history never learned how to see them. Some stories refuse to disappear, no matter how often they are dismissed or rewritten. They change shape, shed details, and adapt to new audiences, but their core remains stubbornly intact. In the centuries after the fall of the Knights Templar, this persistence took the form of myth. Not the kind built on fantasy alone, but myths rooted in memory, distorted, simplified, and encoded so they could survive when facts could not. Among these, none has endured more powerfully than the legends of sacred blood and hidden inheritance. The idea that something precious survived the destruction of the order, whether knowledge, lineage, or divine favor, appears again and again in medieval storytelling. These tales rarely mention the Templars by name. Instead, they speak of guardians, keepers, and chosen families. The language shifts, but the theme remains. What was lost publicly endured privately. The Grail stories are the most famous expression of this impulse. Medieval writers described a sacred object or presence protected by a lineage sworn to secrecy. Sometimes it was a cup, sometimes a stone, sometimes something far more abstract, a truth, a bloodline, a covenant. The ambiguity was deliberate. Symbols endure longer than specifics. In these stories, the guardians are not kings or priests. They are families living apart from the world, bound by loyalty and restraint. Their power lies not in conquest, but in refusal. They do not seek recognition. They wait. This posture mirrors the survival strategies discussed earlier. If the Templars or their associates had wanted to preserve something beyond their own destruction, myth would have been an ideal vessel. Myths do not attract inquisitors. They invite interpretation. Over time, these legends absorbed elements of local history. In some regions, the guardians became Celtic kings. In others, they were Christian knights or monastic communities. The surface changed, but the underlying idea, a lineage entrusted with a secret, remained. Critics often dismiss such connections as romantic fantasy, the product of later imagination projecting meaning onto coincidence. This critique has merit. Myths are not records. They are reflections of desire, fear, and cultural memory. But dismissing them entirely overlooks their function. In societies where direct transmission of dangerous knowledge was impossible, myth provided a way to remember without recording. It allowed stories to be told in altered forms, stripped of details that might provoke persecution. The absence of specificity was protection. The persistence of these myths suggests a collective intuition that the fall of the Templars was incomplete, that something had been interrupted, not extinguished, that families, not institutions, were the true vessels of continuity. This intuition did not arise from evidence alone. It arose from unease. The speed and brutality of the Templars' destruction left unanswered questions. Their wealth was missing. Their networks dissolved too smoothly. Their influence seemed to reappear elsewhere under different names. Myths filled the gap where explanations failed. These stories were not created by elites. They circulated among ordinary people, pilgrims, storytellers, clerics. They were shaped by repetition rather than authorship. Each retelling adjusted details to fit local contexts, but the core remained resilient. Something had been hidden. In some traditions, the secret was framed as royal blood, descendants of sacred kings protected from corrupt power. In others, it was spiritual authority passed through generations outside official church structures. In still others, it was knowledge that threatened established hierarchies. These variations reflect local anxieties rather than historical fact. But their shared structure is revealing. All imagine survival through lineage. All emphasize discretion. All end with waiting rather than conquest. This is not the language of revolution. It is the language of endurance. The Church itself understood the power of myth. It used it extensively to teach, inspire, and control. The difference is that official myths were named and authorized. The myths surrounding lost bloodlines were not. Their anonymity made them resilient. When later movements and writers attempted to systematize these legends, to draw straight lines between Templars, Grail Guardians, and modern institutions, they often oversimplified. History became a puzzle to be solved rather than a pattern to be observed. The danger of this approach is that it seeks certainty where none exists. It demands proof where only traces remain. But myth does not require proof to be meaningful. It requires relevance. The fact that these stories survived centuries of skepticism suggests that they spoke to something real, not necessarily a literal bloodline, but a sense that power does not vanish simply because it is declared illegitimate. Families survive when orders fall. Memory adapts when records are destroyed. The Grail legends and similar myths may be best understood as emotional truths rather than factual ones. They express the belief that what is sacred cannot be easily eradicated, that destruction creates continuity rather than erasing it. In this sense, myth becomes a form of historical commentary. It does not tell us what happened, but how people felt about what happened, and what they felt was unresolved tension. The Knights Templar were supposed to have been erased. The myths insist they were not. This insistence does not prove survival, but it does explain why the idea remains compelling. It offers a narrative where loss is not absolute, where betrayal does not have the final word. As centuries passed, these myths grew more elaborate. They absorbed new symbols, new enemies, new hopes. They became mirrors reflecting the fears of each age. Yet the original outline remained faintly visible beneath the layers. A lineage, a secret, a waiting. The enduring appeal of these stories lies in their refusal to end. They deny closure. They suggest that history is not as final as it pretends to be. For those who believe the Templars left nothing behind, the myths are harmless fantasy. For those who sense gaps in the official narrative, they are invitations to look again, not for answers but for patterns. In the end, myths do not preserve facts. They preserve questions. And the question they continue to ask is simple and unsettling. If something survived the destruction of the Knights Templar, would it look like power, or would it look like ordinary families, living quietly, carrying fragments of a story they no longer fully remember? The myths do not answer this. They exist because the answer was never meant to be spoken aloud. Silence is often mistaken for ignorance, but in institutions built on continuity, silence can be policy. Nowhere is this more evident than in the relationship between the Catholic Church and the lingering questions surrounding the Knights Templar. Officially, the order was condemned, dissolved, and consigned to history. Unofficially, the Church's behavior in the centuries that followed suggests a far more cautious approach, one shaped less by certainty than by awareness of complexity. The papacy that oversaw the Templars' fall was not unified in its judgment. Pope Clement V was a man caught between competing pressures. On one side stood King Philip IV, relentless in his accusations and impatient with delay. On the other stood the uncomfortable truth that the Templars had been created, sanctioned, and empowered by the Church itself. To condemn them fully was to implicate the institution that had blessed them. This tension never fully resolved. The Council of Vienne, which formally dissolved the order, did so without declaring it heretical in doctrine. The language was careful, almost evasive. The Templars were suppressed by way of provision, not condemned through theological verdict. This distinction matters. It allowed the Church to end the order without affirming the truth of the accusations leveled against it. In effect, the Church closed the case without delivering a final judgment. This ambiguity became a cornerstone of Vatican policy. By leaving the matter unresolved, the Church avoided reopening wounds that could destabilize its authority. Silence preserved flexibility. Over the centuries, papal archives accumulated documents related to the Templars, trials, correspondence, depositions. These records were not destroyed. They were sealed. Access was restricted. Scholars who glimpsed fragments reported contradictions, recantations, and doubts that did not align with the simplified narrative taught publicly. This preservation without disclosure is telling. If the Templars had been unquestionably guilty, there would have been no need for caution. Their story could have been used as a warning, a moral lesson to reinforce orthodoxy. Instead, it was quietly set aside. Even more revealing is the Church's tolerance toward institutions and families that appeared to inherit aspects of Templar legacy. The Order of Christ in Portugal operated with papal approval. Former Templar properties were often transferred without thorough investigation into prior arrangements. Local practices associated with Templar estates were rarely scrutinized. This selective enforcement suggests a desire to move forward without probing too deeply into the past. The Church, like any enduring institution, values stability above purity. Revisiting the Templar affair risked exposing uncomfortable truths, not only about the order, but about the mechanisms of power, finance, and coercion within Christendom. It also risked acknowledging that the suppression had been driven by secular interests rather than spiritual necessity. By maintaining a long memory without public engagement, the Vatican preserved its authority while avoiding accountability. Silence became a shield. This approach extended beyond official documents. The Church's treatment of legends and speculation about Templar bloodlines was similarly restrained. It did not actively promote such ideas, but it rarely moved to suppress them forcefully. Myths circulated, were debated, and eventually marginalized not through prohibition but through neglect. Neglect is an effective form of control. By allowing stories to fade rather than confronting them, the Church ensured that they remained fringe, disconnected from formal doctrine. This reduced their potential to challenge authority. At the same time, this passivity suggests confidence. The Church did not behave like an institution threatened by hidden bloodlines or secret heirs. It behaved like one aware that whatever survived no longer posed an immediate danger. This distinction is crucial. If descendants of the Templars existed, they were not claiming authority, challenging doctrine, or organizing resistance. They were integrated, invisible, and compliant enough to be irrelevant. From the Church's perspective, this was acceptable. The Vatican's long memory also manifested in periodic gestures of reconciliation. Centuries later, the Church revisited aspects of the Templar case, acknowledging procedural flaws and expressing regret over the manner of suppression. These gestures were symbolic, not restorative. They did not reopen investigations or offer new interpretations. They served to soften the narrative without changing it. This careful balance reflects an understanding that history is not static. Meanings shift. What was once a threat becomes a curiosity. By controlling how the past is revisited, the Church maintains its role as arbiter of memory. For historians, this creates frustration. Access to records is limited. Answers remain partial. The temptation to speculate grows. But speculation may be exactly what the Church has allowed to persist in place of certainty. By neither confirming nor denying the more intriguing possibilities surrounding the Templars' legacy, the Vatican ensures that no single narrative gains dominance. The story remains diffuse, contested, and ultimately harmless. This strategy mirrors the survival strategies attributed to the Templars themselves. Avoid visibility. Embrace ambiguity. Let time erode urgency. In this sense, the Church and the order it suppressed may share more in common than either would admit. Both understood that power is most secure when it does not need to assert itself. The question of bloodlines, if it exists at all, falls neatly into this framework. Acknowledging it would serve no purpose. Denying it would invite debate. Silence resolves both problems. This does not mean the Church knows more than it reveals. It means that it understands the cost of knowing too much publicly. The Vatican's long memory is not about guarding secrets. It is about guarding stability. And stability often requires leaving certain questions unanswered. The Knights Templar were officially erased. Unofficially, their story was placed in a controlled state of suspension, neither alive nor entirely dead. This liminal status allowed the Church to move forward while carrying the past without confronting it. For those searching for definitive answers, this is unsatisfying. For institutions designed to endure for millennia, it is ideal. History does not always reveal what it remembers. Sometimes it remembers best by refusing to speak at all. Silence is often mistaken for ignorance, but in institutions built on continuity, silence can be policy. Nowhere is this more evident than in the relationship between the Catholic Church and the lingering questions surrounding the Knights Templar. Officially, the order was condemned, dissolved, and consigned to history. Unofficially, the Church's behavior in the centuries that followed suggests a far more cautious approach, one shaped less by certainty than by awareness of complexity. The papacy that oversaw the Templars' fall was not unified in its judgment. Pope Clement V was a man caught between competing pressures. On one side stood King Philip IV, relentless in his accusations and impatient with delay. On the other stood the uncomfortable truth that the Templars had been created, sanctioned, and empowered by the Church itself. To condemn them fully was to implicate the very institution that had raised them to power. This tension never truly resolved. When the Council of Vienne formally dissolved the order in 1312, it did so without a definitive declaration of doctrinal guilt. The language was careful, almost evasive. The Templars were suppressed by way of provision, not convicted through theological judgment. This distinction mattered deeply. It allowed the Church to remove the order while avoiding a formal admission that it had supported heresy for nearly 2 centuries. In effect, the case was closed without a verdict. That ambiguity became the foundation of Vatican policy. By leaving the matter unresolved, the Church preserved flexibility. It avoided reopening a wound that could threaten its moral authority, especially at a time when papal power was already fragile. Silence was safer than certainty. What followed reinforces this interpretation. Documents related to the Templars, trial records, depositions, correspondence between bishops and inquisitors, were not destroyed. They were archived, sealed, restricted. For centuries, access was limited to a select few. When fragments surfaced, they revealed hesitation, coercion, and contradiction rather than clarity. Confessions recanted, accusations questioned, procedures criticized quietly, but never publicly corrected. If the Church had been confident in the righteousness of the suppression, these documents could have been released as proof. Instead, they were buried not to erase the past, but to contain it. This act of preservation without transparency is telling. Even more revealing is the Church's behavior toward institutions and individuals who appeared to inherit aspects of the Templars' legacy. In Portugal, the Order of Christ was not merely tolerated, it was approved. Former Templar lands were transferred with minimal investigation into prior arrangements. The men who once wore the white mantle were allowed to continue serving under a different banner. Elsewhere, former Templar estates were absorbed quietly, often without scrutiny of the families who managed them. Local customs tied to these lands persisted without interference. There was no widespread effort to purge influence, only to dissolve the symbol. This selective enforcement suggests intent. The Church did not seek total eradication. It sought containment. The visible institution was removed, but the underlying social structures were left largely intact. Stability mattered more than purity. Over time, this approach extended to how the Church responded to speculation. Legends of Templar survival, secret bloodlines, and hidden knowledge circulated widely. The Church did not endorse these stories, but it rarely moved to suppress them aggressively. If survival depended on distance, then distance itself became a strategy. After the fall of the Knights Templar, Europe grew smaller in dangerous ways. Networks tightened, authority centralized, records improved. For those who wished to disappear completely, not just from power but from memory, the horizon offered something land could not. The ocean. Long before Columbus sailed west under the banner of Spain, the Atlantic was not an empty void. It was a boundary feared, respected, and occasionally crossed. Fishermen hugged its edges. Traders ventured cautiously along familiar coasts, and a handful of navigators, guided by experience rather than maps, understood its rhythms better than they admitted. The Templars were among the few medieval institutions with the resources, organization, and discipline to think beyond continental borders. They owned ports. They operated fleets. They moved people and goods quietly across long distances. These were not romantic adventurers. They were logistical experts. When their suppression began, those skills did not disappear. The disappearance of certain Templar ships around 1307 has long fueled speculation. Records list vessels assigned to ports that later reported them missing. No wrecks were documented. No seizures recorded. They simply ceased to appear in expected places. Some historians dismiss this as poor bookkeeping. Medieval records were imperfect, after all. But the timing is difficult to ignore. Ships vanish precisely when the order faces extinction. The coincidence strains credibility. If the Templars anticipated destruction, and there is growing reason to believe they did, then maritime escape would have been the safest option. Borders on land were controlled. Roads were watched. But the sea was vast, unpredictable, and largely unpoliced. More importantly, it led away from Europe itself. The idea that medieval Europeans might have reached lands across the Atlantic before Columbus is controversial, but not absurd. Norse settlements in Greenland and Newfoundland had existed centuries earlier. Knowledge of Western lands had not vanished entirely. It had retreated into obscurity. What if the Templars, with access to port infrastructure and navigational experience, chose to follow that obscurity? This does not require imagining grand expeditions or permanent colonies. Survival would not demand conquest. It would demand refuge, temporary settlements, supply points, places to wait. Even a small group, properly supported, could vanish into such a space. Portugal's later maritime success demonstrates that the technical knowledge required was already present. Shipbuilding, navigation by stars and currents, and coastal exploration were not sudden Renaissance miracles. They were the result of accumulated medieval practice. The Templars were part of that accumulation. If some members of the order or families connected to them did cross the Atlantic, they would not have announced themselves. They would have integrated, observed, and adapted. Their goal would not have been domination, but distance. Distance from kings. Distance from popes. Distance from memory. Legends from both sides of the ocean hint at encounters that do not fit official timelines. European artifacts appear in unexpected contexts. Indigenous oral traditions speak of pale visitors who arrived and left without conquest. These fragments are not proof, but they are suggestive. More telling than physical evidence is the persistence of belief. Why has the idea of pre-Columbian transatlantic contact remained so compelling? Because it answers a psychological need left by the Templars' fall. It offers a place for what could not be found in Europe. It provides an ending that feels proportional to the mystery. If something escaped, surely it went far. The Atlantic represents more than geography. It represents possibility. A space where history loses its grip, where documentation thins, and where survival does not require explanation. Even if no permanent settlement was established, the act of crossing itself would have mattered. It would have demonstrated that escape was possible, that Europe was not the whole world. Such knowledge alone would have been invaluable. It is also possible that these journeys were not escapes, but preparations. Reconnaissance for a future that would only become possible generations later. The Order of Christ's role in Portuguese exploration suggests continuity of interest. The skills and curiosity did not emerge suddenly. They had roots. If Templar-associated families survived within Portugal's maritime institutions, then exploration becomes less a national miracle and more a long-delayed continuation. In this light, Columbus's voyage appears not as a beginning, but as a revelation. The moment when secrecy gave way to spectacle. When what had been tentative and hidden became official and irreversible. By then, the danger that had necessitated secrecy was gone. The Templars were centuries dead. Their enemies were dust. What remained were techniques, ambitions, and perhaps memories stripped of their original context. Distance had done its work. Critics argue that this narrative relies too heavily on conjecture. They are right to demand caution. The ocean preserves little. Evidence sinks, decays, or is claimed by new stories. But absence of proof is expected in precisely the kind of movement being imagined. No flags, no charters, no declarations, only departure. What matters is not whether Templars reached the Americas, but why the idea persists. It persists because it fits the pattern established elsewhere. When pressure increases, visibility decreases. When land becomes dangerous, movement turns outward. The Atlantic was the ultimate margin. If families tied to the Templars learned anything from the Order's destruction, it was that power attracts attention, and attention invites annihilation. Distance, by contrast, invites forgetting. Even rumors of Western lands would have been enough to inspire quiet exploration. Even temporary refuge would have been enough to ensure survival. History prefers clean narratives. It prefers beginnings marked by dates and endings marked by fire. But real survival rarely conforms to such boundaries. It slips away. It waits. It reemerges transformed. Whether or not the Templars crossed the Atlantic, the idea that they could have speaks to the deeper truth of their legacy. They thought in systems. They planned beyond immediate horizons. They understood that the world was larger than any one kingdom or church. When Europe closed its doors to them, the sea remained open. And the sea does not keep records. If something of the order escaped into that vastness, people, knowledge, or simply the idea that survival lay beyond authority, then history may never recover it fully. Not because it is hidden, but because it moved somewhere history was not yet prepared to look. By the time the modern era began to take shape, the world had changed in ways the medieval mind could scarcely have imagined. Kingdoms hardened into nation-states. Records became more systematic. Names, dates, and property were increasingly fixed on paper. And yet, even within this tightening web of documentation, certain names continued to surface in ways that felt oddly familiar. They appeared in proximity to power, but rarely at its center. They surfaced near former Templar lands, maritime ventures, financial institutions, and administrative offices. They endured political upheavals with surprising consistency. When regimes changed, they adapted. When borders shifted, they remained relevant. These names did not announce themselves as heirs to anything ancient. They did not claim sacred descent or hidden authority. In fact, what makes them intriguing is precisely their restraint. They appear, disappear, and reappear across centuries, always present, never dominant. In France, some families who rose quietly after the Templar suppression later became fixtures in legal, financial, or ecclesiastical roles. Their genealogies are respectable but curiously shallow, often beginning in the late medieval period with no clear explanation of how wealth or influence was first acquired. Their coats of arms are modest, sometimes featuring symbols that echo older traditions without directly copying them. In Iberia, similar patterns emerge. Families tied to ports, shipbuilding, and overseas trade prospered generation after generation, even as empires rose and fell around them. They rarely led expeditions, but they financed them. They did not command fleets, but they managed logistics. Their names appear in ledgers more often than chronicles. In Scotland, certain clan septs, minor branches rather than ruling lines, maintained persistent influence in specific regions, especially those associated with former religious estates. Their oral histories are rich but vague. Outsiders were always there before memory. Origins are described in poetic terms rather than dates. None of this proves descent from the Knights Templar. But proof is not the point. What stands out is the behavioral continuity. These families exhibit patterns consistent with long experience in surviving political risk. They avoid extremes. They cultivate relationships rather than authority. They invest in land, trade, and knowledge rather than spectacle. They understand instinctively when to step forward and when to withdraw. This instinct is rare. It is not taught easily. It is learned through exposure to danger over generations. One of the most striking patterns is financial adaptability. Some of these families were early participants in banking systems that emerged in Renaissance Europe. They understood credit, trust, and delayed profit. They lent cautiously. They diversified. They survived crashes that ruined more aggressive houses. This mirrors the Templars' original strength, not hoarding gold, but managing flows. As modern historians trace the rise of banking families, they often focus on famous dynasties whose names became synonymous with wealth. But beneath these giants existed quieter networks. Families who facilitated transactions, moved capital discreetly, and avoided political entanglement. They were not innovators in the spotlight. They were stabilizers in the background. The same can be said of colonial expansion. While monarchs claimed territories and explorers claimed glory, these families handled provisioning, contracts, and administration. They operated behind the scenes, where risk could be measured and managed. It is tempting to draw a straight line from medieval Templar logistics to modern financial systems. History resists such simplicity. But the resemblance in method is hard to ignore. Discretion, redundancy, long-term thinking. Another recurring feature is religious moderation. These families tend to be devout without fanaticism. They align with dominant religious institutions but avoid theological extremism. During periods of religious conflict, they often manage to remain intact, shifting allegiance carefully or emphasizing neutrality. This is not cowardice. It is survival strategy. Centuries earlier, the Templars learned the cost of visible autonomy within a volatile religious landscape. That lesson, if absorbed culturally, would have echoed long after the order's name was erased. Critics of bloodline theories rightly caution against pattern seeking. Humans are skilled at finding connections where none exist, but patterns become meaningful when they repeat across geography and time, especially when they align with known historical pressures. The destruction of the Knights Templar was a trauma for medieval Europe's institutional landscape. It sent a clear message: power without accountability would be crushed. Institutions that survived learned to adapt. Families, not orders, became the safest vessels for continuity. If some families internalized this lesson earlier than others, their later success would not require secret descent, only inherited caution. This reframes the question entirely. Instead of asking, which modern families descend from the Templars? A more productive question might be, which families learned, directly or indirectly, from the Templars' fall? Learning does not require blood, but blood preserves memory. Some families preserve it consciously, others unconsciously. In either case, behavior outlasts awareness. The modern names that raise questions do so not because of symbols or legends attached to them, but because of how they behave under pressure. They avoid martyrdom. They avoid absolutism. They prioritize continuity. When revolutions erupt, they lose titles but keep assets. When regimes collapse, they retreat briefly and return quietly. When ideologies change, they adapt language without changing method. This is not conspiracy. It is institutional intelligence embedded at the family level. And it is exceedingly rare. History is filled with families who rose quickly and fell just as fast. What makes these lineages interesting is their endurance without dominance. They never appear powerful enough to threaten authority, yet they are never powerless enough to be erased. This is the sweet spot of survival. Whether this pattern traces back to the Knights Templar directly may never be proven. Records are too fragmented. Silence did its job too well. But the continuity of method suggests that the Order's legacy, if it survived at all, did so in this form. Not as secret rulers, but as quiet participants. The idea of secret families is misleading if it implies active concealment of identity. What may have existed instead is something more subtle. Families who learned, perhaps generations ago, that visibility is dangerous and anonymity is strength. They did not guard a secret about the past. They lived according to a lesson learned from it, and that lesson shaped how they moved through the modern world. If history feels strangely incomplete when it comes to the Knights Templar, it may be because their influence did not end where the records stop. It continued in behaviors that left no obvious trace, passed down not through doctrine or myth, but through habit. The modern names that raise questions do not do so because they point backward clearly. They do so because they fit a pattern that history itself struggles to explain. A pattern of survival without recognition, of power without display, of continuity without confession. And if that pattern feels familiar, it may be because it was learned at a moment when forgetting was the only way forward. In the modern age, where ancestry can be traced through databases and identities, reduced to sequences of letters and numbers, the idea of hidden bloodlines faces a new kind of scrutiny. DNA does not respect legend. It offers patterns, probabilities, and cold percentages. For those fascinated by the possibility that something of the Knights Templar survived in the bodies of their descendants, genetics seems to promise clarity where history refuses to speak. And yet, what genetics reveals is rarely simple. Early attempts to link modern populations to medieval groups focused on surnames and geography. Researchers notice clusters of related male lineages in regions once associated with Templar estates. Certain Y chromosome markers appeared repeatedly in families whose recorded histories did not extend far enough back to explain their presence. These findings sparked excitement, followed quickly by skepticism. The problem lies in interpretation. Genetic markers do not come with labels. They do not say Templar or noble or monk. They record only inheritance. A shared marker can indicate common ancestry, but not when, where, or under what circumstances that ancestry occurred. Medieval Europe was mobile, violent, and interconnected. Soldiers, merchants, pilgrims, and refugees moved constantly. Blood mixed freely. What genetics can show is proximity, not identity. Still, some patterns are difficult to dismiss entirely. In parts of southern France, northern Spain, and Portugal, clusters of rare Y chromosome haplogroups appear in higher concentrations near former Templar strongholds than in surrounding areas. These haplogroups are not unique to those regions, but their density raises questions. Why here? One explanation is coincidence. Another is migration unrelated to the order. But a third possibility lingers, that men associated with the Templars, whether knights, relatives, or affiliates, left descendants who remained rooted near the lands they once managed. If so, genetics would not reveal a single lineage but many small ones. This aligns with the survival strategies discussed earlier. Dispersal, dilution, and silence would produce exactly this kind of genetic footprint. Widespread, faint, and impossible to claim definitively. The most controversial studies involve attempts to link genetic data to medieval burial sites. In rare cases, remains believed to be associated with Templar graves have been analyzed, and their markers compared to modern populations. The results are inconclusive, often frustratingly so. Degradation, contamination, and uncertainty about identity plague such efforts. But even inconclusive data can be revealing. What these studies consistently show is diversity. The Templars were not a genetically homogeneous group. They drew members from across Europe. Their blood, if it survived at all, would be scattered widely, not concentrated in a single family or region. This undermines the idea of a singular Templar bloodline. It supports instead the notion of multiple, overlapping lines that faded into the general population, which is precisely what survival through anonymity would produce. Modern genetic testing companies often market ancestry as a path to personal revelation. Discover your origins. Uncover hidden heritage. But this framing can be misleading. Genetics does not tell stories. It provides fragments that require context. When individuals discover unexpected markers in their DNA, they often search for explanations that feel meaningful. The Knights Templar, with their aura of mystery, offer an appealing narrative. But appeal is not evidence. At the same time, the complete dismissal of genetic clues ignores how history actually unfolds. Not through clean lines, but through messy overlaps. If families connected to the Templars integrated quietly into local populations, their genetic traces would be indistinguishable from those of their neighbors after a few generations. Only careful statistical analysis could reveal subtle patterns, and even then, interpretation would remain uncertain. This uncertainty has led some researchers to adopt a more cautious language. They speak of genetic echoes rather than lineages, of probabilities rather than claims. This language is unsatisfying to those seeking confirmation, but it is honest. An echo implies distance. It suggests that something once present has faded, leaving only faint reverberations. The danger lies in overreach. History is filled with examples of genetic data being used to support romantic or ideological narratives. The temptation to declare proof where none exists is strong, especially when the story is compelling. Responsible scholarship resists this temptation. What genetics does offer, however, is a challenge to absolute claims. The assertion that the Templars left no biological legacy becomes harder to defend in light of evidence that suggests continuity of male lines in specific contexts. At the very least, genetics keeps the question open. And openness is where the story has always lived. Perhaps the most important contribution of genetic research is not what it reveals, but what it reframes. It shifts the conversation away from grand secrets and toward human reality. Men lived. Men died. Some had children. Some of those children survived. Over centuries, their descendants became ordinary. Extraordinary survival does not require extraordinary blood. It requires time. Genetics also highlights the limits of what we can know. Even with modern tools, the past resists complete reconstruction. DNA degrades. Records vanish. Context is lost. The farther back we look, the more the picture dissolves. This dissolution mirrors the very strategies attributed to the Templars' survival. Dilution over time. Integration over isolation. Memory fading into habit. If the order had sought to ensure that something of itself endured, it would not have created a genetic signature obvious enough to be traced centuries later. It would have done exactly what the data suggests. Dispersed. In this sense, the lack of definitive genetic proof is not evidence against survival. It is evidence of successful anonymity. The question then becomes not whether modern individuals can prove descent from the Knights Templar, but whether such proof would matter if they could. Blood alone does not carry ideology, loyalty, or purpose. Those are cultural inheritances, not biological ones. The fascination with DNA reflects a modern desire for certainty in a story defined by ambiguity. Promises answers where history offers only hints. But the Templars' legacy, if it exists, may not be something that can be pinned down by science alone. It may exist in patterns of behavior, in institutional memory, in lessons passed down unconsciously rather than encoded in genes. Genetics can suggest continuity, but it cannot explain meaning. And meaning is what this story has always been about. The echo of the Knights Templar, if it survives at all, does not shout from chromosomes. It whispers through generations, softened by time, blurred by adaptation, and ultimately indistinguishable from the countless other threads that make up human history. That indistinguishability may be the strongest evidence of all. What survives best does not stand apart. It blends in. Some stories are not buried because they are false, but because they are inconvenient. The question of what truly happened to the Knights Templar after their destruction sits squarely in this category. It is a story that unsettles neat narratives, challenges assumptions about power, and exposes uncomfortable truths about how history is written. From the beginning, the official account of the Templars' fall served a purpose. It offered closure, an order accused, tried, and erased. Justice, however flawed, was portrayed as complete. This narrative allowed monarchs and churchmen to move forward without addressing deeper contradictions, financial entanglements, political fear, and institutional hypocrisy. But closure often comes at the cost of curiosity. For generations, historians accepted the official version largely because it fit the available records. Those records, however, were produced by the very authorities that benefited from the order's destruction. Trials were documented by inquisitors. Confessions were recorded under torture. Property transfers were written by royal clerks. These are not neutral sources. Yet challenging them requires confronting the foundations of medieval historiography. It means admitting that entire chapters of history may be shaped more by power than by truth. For many scholars, this is an uncomfortable position. There is also the problem of evidence. The survival of Templar bloodlines, if it occurred, was designed to leave little trace. Families blended in. Names changed. Records were vague. Historians trained to work with documents find such absence deeply frustrating. Absence is often treated as non-existence. This methodological bias has consequences. It privileges visible institutions over invisible ones, formal structures over informal networks. It assumes that what mattered most was recorded, and that what was not recorded did not matter. But history repeatedly proves otherwise. Women's lives, peasant experiences, and informal economies were long ignored because they left fewer written records. When historians finally looked closer, entire worlds emerged from the margins. The same may be true here. The idea of Templar survival through families threatens established categories. It blurs the line between institution and lineage. It suggests that power can migrate into forms that historians are poorly equipped to track. This threatens the authority of traditional narratives. There is also a psychological factor. The image of a total purge, a dramatic ending, is compelling. It satisfies a desire for moral clarity. The idea that something survived feels unresolved, unsettling. Humans prefer endings. Admitting that the story continued in subtle ways complicates our understanding of medieval power. It suggests that institutions are less important than relationships, that official decrees do not always shape reality. For modern audiences, this raises uncomfortable parallels. If the Templars could survive the destruction of their order, what does that say about other purges, other revolutions, other supposed endings? How often do we mistake surface change for transformation? These questions are not just historical. They are political. Challenging the narrative of total destruction also threatens modern institutions that trace legitimacy through clean historical lines. If continuity can exist without documentation, then authority becomes less secure. This may explain why bloodline theories are often dismissed quickly, sometimes reflexively. It is easier to label them as conspiracy than to engage with their implications. To be clear, many such theories deserve dismissal. They oversimplify, exaggerate, and ignore evidence. But dismissing all inquiry into survival closes the door on legitimate questions. There is a difference between skepticism and avoidance. The story of the Knights Templar sits at the intersection of both. It attracts sensationalism, which makes serious discussion difficult. Scholars fear association with fringe ideas. As a result, the topic becomes polarized, either total annihilation or grand conspiracy. The reality, as always, likely lies in between. The most plausible scenario is not secret domination or hidden empires. It is quiet adaptation. Families absorbing shock, preserving what they could, and moving on. This is not exciting. It does not sell books or capture imaginations easily. But it fits the evidence. It also fits human behavior. When faced with existential threat, people do not always fight or flee dramatically. Often they adapt quietly. They change names, occupations, and allegiances. They protect their children and forget what must be forgotten. History rarely records this kind of survival because it leaves no monuments. The burial of this story, then, may not be deliberate suppression so much as structural blindness. Historians are trained to see what institutions leave behind, not what families carry forward invisibly. And yet, this blindness has consequences. By accepting the narrative of total destruction, we simplify the past in ways that make it easier to control. We turn complex human systems into morality plays. We assign blame, pronounce judgment, and move on. But the past resists such simplicity. The Knights Templar were not destroyed because they were heretical. They were destroyed because they were inconvenient. They sat at the crossroads of faith, finance, and power in a way that threatened emerging state authority. Understanding what survived that destruction requires looking beyond documents and into patterns of behavior, geography, and continuity. It requires humility. Modern historiography prides itself on rigor, but rigor can become rigidity. When certain questions are deemed unworthy of exploration, not because they lack evidence but because they challenge assumptions, history becomes doctrine. This is not how knowledge advances. The story of the Templars endures not because it promises hidden truths, but because it exposes the limits of what we think we know. It reminds us that history is written by survivors, and survival often requires silence. To unbury this story does not mean accepting every claim. It means acknowledging uncertainty. It means being willing to say, "We do not know everything, and we may never." This is not weakness. It is intellectual honesty. The Knights Templar vanished from the records abruptly. Their influence, however, did not vanish with equal clarity. The gap between those two facts is where the buried story lives. It has been ignored because it is uncomfortable. It has been buried because it refuses to stay simple. And perhaps most importantly, it has been left untouched because it forces us to reconsider how power, memory, and survival truly work. History does not always end where we are told it ends. Sometimes it simply becomes harder to see. When the story narrows itself to trials, kings, and institutions, something essential is lost. The destruction of the Knights Templar is often told as a clash between power and heresy, between crown and order. But beneath those abstractions were lives, ordinary, fragile, deeply human. To understand what may have survived, the focus must return to those lives, to the emotional cost carried by individuals whose names history barely recorded. For the men arrested in 1307, faith was not an idea. It was routine, prayer at fixed hours, silence at meals, obedience enforced not through fear alone, but through belief. Many had entered the order young, shaped by its discipline long before they understood its politics. When they were accused of betraying Christ, the charge cut deeper than any blade. It was not merely an attack on reputation, it was an attack on identity. Some died under torture. Others lived long enough to see their world collapse around them. For those who survived imprisonment, release did not mean freedom. They were stripped of purpose, scattered, and often forbidden to speak of their past. Imagine devoting decades to a life defined by absolute commitment, only to be told that life had been a lie or worse, a crime. This was not a clean ending. It was dislocation. For those connected to the Knights, families, servants, allies, the cost was quieter but no less severe. Livelihoods vanished overnight. Estates changed hands. Long-standing relationships became dangerous. Loyalty, once a virtue, became a liability. In this atmosphere, survival demanded emotional restraint. Grief had to be hidden. Anger had to be swallowed. Even memory became risky. Children growing up in the aftermath would have sensed this tension without understanding it. They would have learned early that certain topics were avoided, certain names never spoken. Silence would not have been explained. It would have been modeled. This kind of silence shapes character, produces caution, teaches patience. It values continuity over confrontation. These are not romantic traits. They are coping mechanisms born of trauma. Faith, too, was reshaped. For many associated with the Templars, belief in God did not disappear with the order. But belief in institutions may have been permanently altered. The Church, which had once sanctified the order, now stood behind its destruction. Trust was broken in ways that could not be repaired through doctrine. This does not mean people lost faith. It means faith became private. Private faith leaves few records. It is practiced in habits rather than declarations, in ethics rather than allegiance. It does not require recognition to endure. Families shaped by this experience would have taught their children to believe quietly, to serve without spectacle, to avoid positions that demanded absolute loyalty to volatile institutions. This was not cynicism. It was wisdom learned at great cost. Fire teaches caution. The emotional legacy of the Templars' fall may be the most enduring aspect of their story. Trauma does not disappear when events fade from memory. It transforms into values passed down unconsciously: wariness of power, preference for stability, reluctance to stand too close to the center. These values align strikingly with the behavioral patterns seen in families discussed earlier. Avoiding extremes, maintaining adaptability, prioritizing survival over glory. This suggests that whatever survived was not an ideology or a plan, but an emotional inheritance. Courage, in this context, was redefined. It was no longer the courage to charge into battle or defy authority openly. It was the courage to endure quietly, to rebuild without acknowledgement, to let go of pride. This kind of courage rarely makes history books. Betrayal also left its mark. The suddenness of the arrests, the role of former allies, the complicity of institutions, all contributed to a sense that loyalty was conditional and fragile. Trust became something to be given sparingly. Greed played its part as well. The financial motives behind the suppression were never invisible to those affected. Watching sacred vows used as cover for asset seizure leaves a lasting impression. It teaches that ideals can be weaponized. Children raised in such an environment would have learned to separate rhetoric from reality. They would have understood that words often hide intentions, and that survival depends on reading between the lines. Destiny, once framed as divine calling, became something more ambiguous. The Templars had believed their mission was ordained. Its violent end challenged that belief. For those who lived on, destiny may have come to mean something less grand but more reliable. Responsibility to family, to continuity, to the future rather than the past. This shift is subtle but profound. It moves the focus from collective salvation to personal stewardship, from obedience to discernment, from visible righteousness to quiet integrity. Such a transformation does not produce movements, produces families. The emotional weight carried by these families would not have been discussed openly. Trauma rarely is. Instead, it would have surfaced in behaviors, reluctance to draw attention, instinctive caution around authority, emphasis on preparedness. These are not glamorous traits, but they are effective ones. When later generations faced their own crises, wars, plagues, revolutions, they would have drawn on this inherited caution. They would have known, perhaps without knowing why, that survival often depends on not standing where history is loudest. The emotional legacy also explains why, if Bloodline survived, they did not seek recognition. Pride had proven dangerous. Memory had proven costly. Survival had proven sufficient. Faith, fire, and family are not abstract themes here. They are lived experiences that shaped decisions over generations. The faith that endured did so quietly. The fire that destroyed the order left lessons rather than ashes. The family became the only structure worth trusting fully. This is the human dimension often missing from discussions of secret survival. It was not about preserving power. It was about preserving life. The Knights Templar, as an institution, died publicly. The people who lived through that death carried its consequences privately. And it is in those private spaces, around tables, in whispered advice, in choices made cautiously, that the most durable legacy may have taken shape. Not a legacy of domination, but a legacy of endurance. By the time the echoes of the trials faded and the fires burned low, something essential had already changed. The Knights Templar, as an institution, no longer existed. Their banners were outlawed, their rule dissolved, their name spoken only in accusation or legend. And yet, when viewed from a longer distance, the end does not feel like an ending at all. It feels like a transition. Orders are fragile things. They depend on recognition, hierarchy, and visibility. Families do not. They require no charters, no approval, no justification beyond survival. When the order fell, what remained was not a void, but a shift, from structure to strategy, from institution to inheritance. This shift explains much of what followed. If the Templars had attempted to preserve themselves as an order, they would have been hunted relentlessly. Any visible continuation would have invited renewed suspicion. Names, titles, and rituals were liabilities. Survival demanded invisibility, and invisibility demanded transformation. Families provided that transformation naturally. A family does not issue decrees. It does not challenge kings. It grows quietly, adapts instinctively, and disperses when threatened. Where an order concentrates power, a family distributes it. Where an order enforces obedience, a family teaches discretion. This was not a conscious blueprint. It was an evolution shaped by pressure. The men who had once lived under a strict rule now lived under looser bonds: marriage, kinship, obligation. These bonds were less efficient than institutional command, but they were far more resilient. They could bend without breaking. They could survive contradiction. The skills that had once defined the order did not vanish. They were simply repurposed. Organizational thinking became estate management. Logistical expertise became trade and finance. Discipline became routine. Secrecy became habit. None of this required a shared identity. In fact, shared identity would have been dangerous. What persisted instead was a way of seeing the world. An understanding that power is temporary, that visibility attracts danger, and that survival often depends on patience rather than confrontation. These are not mystical insights. They are lessons learned through loss. When viewed through this lens, the idea that the order never ended does not mean it continued as itself. It means that what mattered most about it, its approach to survival, outlived its name. The order ended because it could be named, accused, and destroyed. Families could not. Over generations, this shift would have become complete. Children born long after the suppression would not have known they were carrying anything forward. They would have inherited behaviors, not memories. Caution without explanation. Discipline without doctrine. This is how continuity becomes invisible. Institutions leave ruins. Families leave patterns. The ruins of Templar castles still stand in places, admired as relics of a vanished world. The patterns, however, are harder to see. They appear in how certain families relate to authority, how they manage risk, how they survive upheaval. They appear in an instinctive understanding that alignment with power must be temporary, conditional, and reversible. This understanding is not common. Most families rise and fall with the tides of history. They gamble on kings, ideologies, revolutions. They win spectacularly or lose catastrophically. The families that endure are those that avoid such gambles. This does not make them heroic. It makes them cautious. The transformation from order to family also altered the meaning of loyalty. Loyalty to an institution can be demanded. Loyalty to a family must be chosen repeatedly. It is reinforced through care, obligation, and shared survival. This form of loyalty is quieter, but deeper. If the Templars' greatest strength had been obedience, their greatest vulnerability had been visibility. By dissolving into families, that vulnerability disappeared. What remained was adaptability. This adaptability is what gives rise to the unsettling sense that the order never truly ended. Not because its members conspired in secret, but because the way they learned to survive proved transferable. The white mantle was a uniform. Uniforms attract attention. Families do not. The Red Cross was a symbol. Symbols invite interpretation. Habits do not. Once these outer layers were shed, what remained could move freely through history without drawing notice. This reframing also dissolves the more fantastical versions of the story. There is no need for secret councils, hidden masters, or grand designs. Survival does not require conspiracy. It requires restraint. In many ways, the true end of the order came not with arrests or executions, but with acceptance. Acceptance that the world had changed, that the age of autonomous military orders was ending, that endurance required a different form. The Templars were not unique in making this transition. Other groups faced similar pressures and adapted accordingly. What makes the Templars distinctive is how completely the transition appears to have succeeded. So successful, in fact, that it left historians with little to trace. If something continues too quietly, it disappears from record. History notices noise. It misses continuity. This is why the question of whether the order ever truly ended remains compelling. It is not a question about facts alone. It is a question about how we define endings. Do things end when they are declared over? Or do they end when their influence disappears? If influence is measured in behavior rather than structure, then the answer becomes less clear. The Knights Templar, as an institution, ended decisively. As a way of organizing life, risk, and loyalty, they may have persisted in forms that no longer resembled themselves. And perhaps that was the final lesson learned from their destruction. Power that insists on recognition invites annihilation. Power that adapts to invisibility endures. By becoming families, by dissolving into the ordinary flow of life, whatever the Templars had been became unremarkable, and therefore untouchable. Not immortal, but unending in the only way that truly matters. By no longer needing to be seen,